story of Red Dead Redemption does not end where the camera fades to black. It lingers on a windswept hill above the Heartlands, where Arthur Morgan's grave looks out over a valley he could never save, and it echoes through the creaking boards of Beecher's Hope, where John Marston's dream of a quiet ranch becomes a target painted on his back. These places are graves, yes, but they are also markers. The world was changing, and it refused to die just because its heroes did. From the very beginning, this is not simply a story of one gang or one family. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom promised and freedom denied as civilization tightens its grip on the frontier. The van der Linde gang rides through it as the living embodiment of a dying philosophy, insisting that the old ways were dying even as they cling to them with bloody hands. Their fall, from its humble beginnings in idealistic robbery to its end in paranoia and collapse, mirrors the American West itself, wild, hopeful, violent, and then suddenly fenced off. Arthur's grave and Beecher's Hope stand as quiet proof that the part players know has ended. The credits roll, the gunsmoke clears, and the last ride feels final. Yet trains still cut across New Hanover, oil still seeps from the ground in West Elizabeth, and the telegraph wires still hum with distant orders. What happens to the land after the outlaws are gone? What becomes of the towns that once whispered their names in fear, or the governments that learned how to hunt them? This saga will not retell every robbery and campfire argument. Instead, it will follow the trail left behind, the counties and territories, the sheriffs and Pinkertons, the surviving outlaws, and the people who tried to become more than a lost soul with a gun. From the smog over Saint Denis to the dust of Armadillo, from Blackwater's guarded harbor to the empty streets of Tumbleweed, the map itself becomes the narrator of what came next. The span stretches from the ashes of 1899 and the fragile peace of 1907 into the harsher, colder world of 1911, where Red Dead Redemption's first tale begins hunting John Marston. In that gap, railroads expand, corporate barons tighten their hold, and the federal government learns to turn men like Edgar Ross into weapons. The shadow of these years even reaches forward into the modern West, where highways now run where wagon ruts once cut the earth. In the truest sense, the van der Linde gang is a microcosm of a dying frontier. Their makeshift family, their shifting philosophy of freedom, their blood-soaked compromises become the blueprint for how the world hardens into the America that comes for John. As each camp falls and each dream fractures, the surrounding world takes notes, adapts, and evolves. The question is not only how the gang ended, but how everything around them learned to live without them. And that is where this story truly begins, with a grave, a ranch, and a West that refuses to stay buried. The promise begins here. Every town, every survivor, every scar. Not just the famous names on wanted posters, but the nameless workers on the rail lines, the silent bartenders, the broken sheriffs, the forgotten ranch hands. This is not only a story of one gang's destruction, but of a whole world rearranging itself in the shadow of their fall. The vantage point is clear. The last camp has burned, Arthur Morgan is gone, and Dutch's grand philosophy lies shattered in the mud at Beaver Hollow. John Marston rides away from that grave and toward Beecher's Hope, chasing a fragile dream of freedom, family, and quiet respectability. In the truest sense, the gang is finished. Yet only a few years later, in Red Dead Redemption's 1911, that same man stands on a very different ridge, staring down a West that barely remembers the van der Linde name. Between those two ridges lies the gap this story will cross. From its humble beginnings as a loose band of idealistic outlaws to the moment federal agents lead John to his death, the world was changing faster than any of them understood. The old ways were dying, and the map itself became the living embodiment of that death. New Hanover's rail yards swelling, Lemoyne's plantations consolidating, West Elizabeth's oil fields multiplying. New Austin's frontier hardening into property lines and telegraph poles. To trace that transformation, the method must be ruthless and precise. The closing pages of Red Dead Redemption 2's epilogue, the altered town layouts and frontier ruins in Red Dead Redemption 1, the newspapers trumpeting industrial triumphs and quiet tragedies, the stray lines of dialogue about who lived, who fled, and who simply disappeared. All of it forms a hidden record. Piece by piece, region by region, it reveals a continuous history that was never granted a single cutscene. The structure of this tale will follow that buried chronology. First, the land, New Hanover's expanding tracts, Lemoyne's uneasy peace, West Elizabeth's booming Blackwater, New Austin's sick towns and abandoned dreams. Then, the people. Dutch in hiding, Bill and Javier recast as regional terrors, Uncle drinking his way through the years, Pearson, Mary Beth, and Tilly finding unexpected lives within civilization, while Sadie and Charles vanish into the margins where law still fears to tread. Finally, the larger forces that bind them all, railroads tightening their iron grip, oil barons claiming the horizon, government agents evolving from Pinkertons to the bureau that owns John's fate. The journey moves from the ashes of Beaver Hollow and the quiet fences of Beecher's Hope to a landscape where even Beecher's Hope is no refuge. It begins with a grave and a ranch. It ends when the last outlaw becomes obsolete, when loyalty is repaid with bullets from the state, and when the dreams and delusions of Dutch's gang are swallowed by the march of civilization. How does that happen? Step by step, town by town, life by life. That is the world this story is about to uncover. To understand what that world becomes, the story has to return to the very beginning of Dutch's philosophy, to the campfire sermons that held this fragile family together. In Dutch's mind, the gang was not just a pack of thieves, it was the living embodiment of resistance, freedom from government, loyalty to a chosen family, a life lived in motion, always one step ahead of the noose and the surveyor's line. He preached that civilization was a cage, and that the outlaw trail was, in the truest sense, the only honest way to live. No bosses, no landlords, no taxmen, just open country and self-made law. Around those fires, this sounded less like criminal bravado and more like a rough-hewn political philosophy, a story of men and women trying to carve out a space the modern world had no interest in granting them. But even before the fall, the cracks were there. Dutch railed against the corruption of railroads and oil barons, then quietly cut deals with men like Angelo Bronte and Leviticus Cornwall when it suited him. He thundered about loyalty, about family above all, then left John to rot in Sisika and walked away from Arthur in the mud. The man who claimed to hate the state became a mirror of it, demanding obedience, enforcing his will, punishing dissent. The old ways were dying, and Dutch was helping kill them while insisting he was their last defender. Each camp the gang raised was a temporary utopia built in the margins of an unjust system. Coulter in the blizzard, Horseshoe Overlook above the railroad tracks, Clemens Point on the edge of Lemoyne's plantations, Shady Bell in the shadow of Saint Denis, Beaver Hollow buried in the woods. For a season, these places felt almost fair. Food shared, work divided, the weak protected by the strong. Then the Pinkertons rode closer, the trains grew louder, and those fragile worlds vanished overnight. Railroads, oil derricks, and fences followed in their wake, swallowing the spaces where that idealistic dream had briefly taken root. The meadow where wagons once circled would one day sit under telegraph wires. The trail where Arthur and Charles hunted became a line on some bureaucrat's map. Civilization did not simply arrive. It paved, fenced, and bought everything that stood still long enough to be owned. Yet the land remembers. The rocks above Horseshoe Overlook, the bayous near Shady Bell, the cliffs around Beaver Hollow. These are places where men bled for a philosophy that could not survive contact with progress. Later, those same hills would be scarred by roads, dotted with ranches, or left to rot as forgotten corners of a tamed frontier. But the ghosts remain. Every abandoned cabin, every burned wagon, every nameless grave is a quiet rebuttal to the triumphal story of progress. Dutch was not wrong about one thing: the world was changing, and there would be no place for men like him. But what did that new world actually look like once the last outlaw was a bounty poster, a cautionary tale, or a corpse on a government ledger? The answer is not in a cutscene or a speech. It is written across the land itself. Rockstar never sits the player down and explains in neat exposition what happened after the gang scattered and the Marstons tried to build a quiet life. Instead, the world becomes the storyteller. From its humble beginnings as a rugged frontier in 1899 to the more ordered landscape of 1911, the map turns into a silent history book, a story of loyalty and betrayal traced in rail lines, ruined towns, and smokestacks. Look first to New Hanover and Lemoyne, the early heartland of Dutch's idealistic philosophy. In 1899, those regions still breathed with the illusion of freedom, wide prairies, small rail spurs, crumbling plantations clinging to the past. By the time John rides again in 1911, that space has shifted. More telegraph poles march along the tracks. More fences carve up open range. More industry tightens its grip. The world was changing, and the map shows it without a single word. West Elizabeth tells an even sharper story. At the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2, Blackwater is already a symbol of modernization, the place where the gang's dreams crash into gunfire on a ferry. Years later, in Red Dead Redemption, Blackwater has grown into the living embodiment of civilization on the frontier: paved streets, electric lights, corporate offices, a town pointed firmly toward the 20th century. The disaster that shattered the gang becomes, to the outside world, a footnote on the road to progress. Then, the pattern breaks. Ride south to New Austin, and the illusion of smooth advancement falls apart. Armadillo, once a dusty but functioning frontier town, has collapsed into plague, death, and abandonment by 1911. Tumbleweed, which in the gang's day still shows signs of civic ambition, now lies windblown and empty, its gallows creaking over a town that gave up. Why does Blackwater thrive while Armadillo rots? Why does Tumbleweed die while Thieves' Landing festers on? The fate of each town reflects forces larger than any one outlaw. Rail routes bypass Tumbleweed and strangle its economy. Disease and neglect turn Armadillo into a warning rather than a destination. Government attention, corporate money, and the logic of profit concentrate in Blackwater and the Great Plains, while the edges of the map are left to decay. In the truest sense, the old ways were dying, but not in a clean or heroic fashion. Every ghost town, every burned building, every new telegraph pole can be read as a reaction to the Chaos Dutch and his family unleashed and the government's response. Lawmen and agents push harder into the frontier. Corporations seize land and resources. And the spaces where outlaws once hid are either paved over or left poisoned and empty. Even where the gang is gone, its shadow lingers. That is how this story will unfold, again and again, returning to the map as to a palimpsest, reading the layers beneath John's ride and Jack's future, searching each region for the fading fingerprints of the Linde gang. And nowhere is that palimpsest more haunting than in Blackwater. From the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption's timeline, Blackwater is the ghost at the edge of the map, a prosperous town built on an event the game never fully shows. Newspapers, stray conversations, and wanted posters let the outlines emerge: a botched ferry robbery on the upper Montana River, Dutch's gang going in for a big score, and everything going catastrophically wrong. Civilians on deck, gunfire in the smoke, bodies in the water. A story of freedom turned instantly into a public massacre. What was meant to be one more outlaw job becomes a national scandal. The Blackwater Massacre, as the papers christen it, is reported as a slaughter of innocents by a band of anarchists and degenerates. The details are murky, the blame conveniently simple. Dutch's philosophy, with its talk of resisting civilization and robbing the corrupt, is reduced to a headline about butchery. Families lose fathers and children on that ferry, politicians see an opportunity, and suddenly, this is not just a crime, it is a justification. In the truest sense, Blackwater is where the government wins. The outrage unlocks funding, expands mandates, and gives men in suits permission to do whatever is necessary to secure the frontier. Pinkerton agents who once answered to railroads and private capital now operate with federal backing. The same machinery that hunts Dutch through the mountains will, a decade later, become the bureau that holds John Marston's family hostage. One ferry job pays for an entire apparatus of control. Dutch feels it before he understands it. On that shore, watching the plan dissolve in screams and blood, he sees that the world was changing faster than his old tricks. The gang's mythology of precision, of never hurting those who did not deserve it, shatters in a single morning. From its humble beginnings as a band that robbed the rich and preached about justice, the Linde gang is recast as the living embodiment of chaos. Dutch insists it was a setup, a betrayal, a conspiracy. Maybe he even believes it. But beneath the paranoia lies a simpler terror. His time is ending. By the time John rides through in 1911, Blackwater has paved streets, electric lights, and respectable brick storefronts. There are theaters, tailors, banks, and law offices where outlaws once slipped through alleys. The town sells itself as the future of the West, a clean, ordered civilization with no memory of bodies in the river. Progress, on the surface. Erasure, Underneath, is it an accident that the most modern place on the map is built over the gang's greatest failure? Blackwater becomes a pattern in miniature. Every region the gang touched will face the same choice: submit to the march of progress, or be left as a ruin on the edge of someone else's empire. Some towns will shine, others will rot, but none will stay the same. Blackwater is not just a town, it is the hinge on which a new kind of power swings open. From its humble beginnings as a river port and ferry stop, it becomes the testing ground for something far more unsettling than any outlaw: a government learning how to hunt its own citizens with modern tools, modern money, and modern law. At the very beginning, the men chasing Dutch's gang are not federal agents in tailored suits, but Pinkertons in dust-stained coats. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency in Red Dead Redemption 2 is a story of privatized law and hired loyalty, a quasi-private army on retainer for railroads, banks, and industrial barons. These are the same men who break strikes, guard oil fields, and drag debtors from their homes, the living embodiment of a world where corporations rent violence the way they rent land. To Cornwall and his allies, the gang is just another problem to be managed. Outlaws, unionists, troublesome ranchers in Annisburg or Valentine, it makes little difference. Pinkertons flood the hills around Clements Point, surround the Saint Denis Bank, and ride into Beaver Hollow with shotguns raised, treating Dutch's family and starving miners as two sides of the same ledger. The old ways were dying, but not from some abstract march of civilization. They are shot, burned, and audited out of existence. Then comes the Blackwater Massacre. A ferry robbery gone wrong, a pile of bodies, whispers of women and children caught in the crossfire. In a country already nervous about anarchists, labor unrest, and roaming gangs, Blackwater becomes a scandal, a symbol. A question shouted in newspapers from Saint Denis to Washington: how many more Dutch van der Lindes can this fragile civilization afford? The answer is simple: centralize, professionalize, federalize. Political pressure after Blackwater pushes the government toward a new solution, one that does not depend entirely on private detectives with dubious reputations. By the time Red Dead Redemption begins in 1911, the nameless bureau that seizes John Marston from his ranch is the direct heir to those lessons. It is a precursor to the FBI in the truest sense, born from fear of chaos and the belief that the state must reach everywhere. Where Milton chased camps through snow and swamps, Edgar Ross and Archer Fordham use signatures, telegrams, and blackmail. They do not storm Beecher's Hope with a posse. They take Abigail and Jack, weaponize John's guilt, and turn an outlaw into a government asset pointed at Bill, Javier, and finally Dutch. Is there any greater betrayal of Dutch's philosophy than his surrogate son riding under federal orders? This is the new manhunt state, less about posses on the horizon, more about files in a drawer. A ranch in New Austin, a saloon in Armadillo, a reservation in the far north, no place is beyond its reach. As the bureau grows, the map does not expand. It tightens. Every telegraph pole another bar on an invisible cage. Dutch's final stand on a cliff and John's death in a fence-eaten barn are not just tragic endings. They are proof that the world was changing so completely that even death begins to feel administrated. And if the law can do that to Dutch and John, what does it do to the towns and people they leave behind? For New Hanover, that invisible cage does not fall all at once. It tightens in stages, across prairies that once felt endless and lawless, across river valleys that once echoed with the laughter and gunfire of a wandering camp. The land that had been the gang's early game playground becomes a case study in how the old ways were dying long before anyone carved dates into gravestones. From its humble beginnings in the story, New Hanover is presented as the living embodiment of the frontier dream. Open heartlands, wild herds, and small towns where the line between ranch hand and outlaw blurs with each payday. At Horseshoe Overlook, the gang can breathe, raid, and vanish into grass seas that seem to belong more to cattle and bandits than to corporations or government timetables. It feels, in the truest sense, like there is still room in the world for men who refuse to be written down. But even in those early days, the seeds of betrayal are already hammered into the soil with every telegraph pole. The railroads that cut through New Hanover are not just background scenery. They are arteries of a new civilization, bringing marshals, Pinkertons, company agents, and distant investors who will never smell coal dust or horse sweat. Each new spur, each fresh line of wire makes it harder to disappear, harder to live off the map as Dutch's philosophy demands. A train schedule is a promise, and a prison, all at once. Valentine becomes the first visible test of that change. Once a rough cattle town where drunken ranchers, traveling merchants, and passing outlaws jostle in the same muddy streets, it begins to harden after the gang's chaos. The barroom brawls, the shootouts, the brazen daylight robberies leave scars that local ranchers and business interests cannot ignore. Lawmen gain broader authority, banks and stables tighten records, and the town shifts from a place where anything can happen to a regulated hub that tolerates only profitable risk. Freedom gives way to predictability, not through a single decree, but through 100 small rules nailed to the walls. Further north and east, in Annisburg and the coal country, the transformation is even harsher. There, the outlaw is not the main predator, the company is. Miners choke on dust, families drown in debt, and the conflict that replaces bandit raids is a quieter but more relentless war between labor and ownership. Strikes, blacklists, and hired guns become the new gunfights. It is a story of exploitation rather than quick-draw heroics, of men fighting for wages instead of wanted posters. In such a new Hanover, ruled by timetables, payrolls, and company scrip, what future could there be for someone like Arthur Morgan, had he survived? A hired guard for the very trains he once robbed, a nameless foreman breaking strikes in Annisburg, or a lost soul drifting between ranches that no longer need his gun. The world was changing, and in that changing world, even survival might have felt like its own kind of defeat. And New Hanover is only the beginning. Beyond its rail lines and coal pits, other regions would be carved up, fenced in, and sold off to progress with even less mercy. New Hanover is only the beginning, but Lemoyne is the warning. A story of what happens when a region loses a war, refuses to admit it, and then gets conquered again. This time not by soldiers, but by suits. In 1899, Lemoyne is still bleeding from the Civil War. The battlefields have gone quiet, yet the plantations and swamps remain haunted, in the truest sense, by men who cannot let the past die. The Lemoyne Raiders cling to their tattered uniforms and their delusions of a restored Confederacy, hitting federal convoys, ambushing patrols, and terrorizing freedmen and travelers. Crime is woven into the soil itself, moonshine in the bayou, illicit weapons in the manor houses, bodies dumped in the marsh where the law pretends not to see. From its humble beginnings as a refuge for deserters and diehards, the Raiders become the living embodiment of a lost cause that never had a future. When Arthur and the Van der Linde gang collide with them, it is not just outlaw against outlaw, it is one dying era colliding with another. And when the gang leaves Shady Belle, when the Pinkertons close in and Dutch's dream shatters, something important happens in the vacuum they leave behind. The loudest guns in Lemoyne fall silent, and that silence creates opportunity. With the Raiders broken and the Van der Linde gang scattered, more formal power steps in. State militias, federal marshals, and local political machines move to assert control over a region that had lived half in rebellion for decades. The chaos that once gave cover to raiders and revolutionaries now becomes a liability to investors and politicians. Stability, not freedom, becomes the new watchword. Was this victory for civilization, or just a different kind of occupation? At the center of that transformation stands Saint Denis. Even in 1899, it is the engine of the region, a city of factories, financiers, and backroom politicians. The world was changing, and Saint Denis makes that change visible. Smokestacks on the horizon, electric lights burning through the swamp haze. Stockbrokers and shipping magnates quietly doing more damage to the old ways than any cannon ever did. As the years pass, the city's money and influence seep outward, taming the countryside mile by mile. The bayou, once a maze of moonshiners, smugglers, and outlaw hideouts, likely shifts toward more regulated, profit-driven operations tied to national markets. Rural plantations, built on slave-era hierarchies and enforced by men with whips and rifles, are reshaped by credit, contracts, and corporate ownership. The faces in charge might change, the ledgers grow thicker, but the philosophy remains cold. Land exists to generate profit, not dreams. By the time of Red Dead Redemption, Lemoyne is more stable, more profitable, and far more tightly controlled. The old ways were dying, yet what replaces them is hardly romantic. The region's mythic southern past, its doomed cavalry charges and decaying mansions, is overshadowed by rail lines, telegraph poles, and balance sheets. The irony is brutal. In trying to hold on to their imagined freedom, men like the Lemoyne Raiders helped usher in a world where freedom is rarer than ever, quietly bought and sold in offices overlooking the same streets where they once bled. And if Lemoyne can be tamed, what chance do the wilder territories have when the same forces turn their gaze westward? The answer comes quickly. The gaze turns to West Elizabeth. From its humble beginnings as a half-finished experiment in progress, West Elizabeth becomes the proving ground for what tamed America will look like. In 1899, it is a place on the cusp, caught between the old ways and the new order. Blackwater already wears the clothes of civilization, with brick storefronts, electric lamps, and a harbor buzzing with river traffic, while only a short ride away, Strawberry and the Great Plains still feel raw, improvised, almost temporary. In those days, Blackwater is ambitious, but fragile. The town is modern in the truest sense, but its foundations are thin, nouveau riche investors, a restless working class, and outlaws watching from the tree line. The ferry job gone wrong on Flatiron Lake changes all of that. The Blackwater Massacre is not just a botched robbery, it is a public humiliation, a story of failure, blood, and federal embarrassment, splashed across newspapers and whispered in boardrooms. That shame becomes fuel. Over the next decade, Blackwater is rebuilt not merely as a town, but as the living embodiment of the government's promise that the frontier can be civilized, regulated, monetized. Money pours in, new docks, wider streets, cleaner facades, more lawmen. What was once a disputed shoreline becomes a showcase of polite society, the kind of place where officials can point and say, this is what progress looks like, even as the memory of bodies in the water is quietly buried under brick and concrete. Further west, clinging to the mountains, Strawberry faces a different fate. In 1899, it is a strange little kingdom, ruled by an eccentric mayor who dreams of tourism while his town still smells of wet timber and desperation. But the world was changing. As the years pass, state oversight tightens, the logging interests professionalize, and Strawberry's quirks are shaved down into marketable charm. The rickety bridge gives way to safer routes, the ramshackle cabins to regulated lodging. What began as an isolated oddity becomes a managed attraction, a gateway for city visitors chasing curated wilderness rather than true danger. South of both, the Great Plains undergo an even more dramatic transformation. Once an open sweep of grass, bison bones, and outlaw hideouts, it becomes a grid. Fences rise where wild herds once ran, ranches expand, windmills turn, and the railroad's iron spine digs deeper into the soil. Law enforcement grows bolder here, patrolling land that used to belong only to the sky and whoever was willing to kill for it. Freedom shrinks to the size of a deed and a barbed wire claim. On the surface, West Elizabeth seems to win. It becomes the model state, the poster child for order. Yet that polish throws a harsher light on what lies beyond. Because while Blackwater shines and Strawberry is domesticated, the southern borderlands across the river begin to rot. New Austin will tell a different story, one where the old ways were dying, but nothing healthy grows in their place. Across the San Luis River, New Austin stands as the last harsh frontier, the living embodiment of a promise already gone bad. The land is arid, the sky enormous, and the settlements scattered across dust and rock feel temporary even when built in brick. Law arrives late, infrastructure arrives broken, and ambition always seems to outrun the thin, cracking shell of civilization trying to contain it. From its humble beginnings, New Austin was sold as freedom, cheap land, fast money, no questions. Ranchers, prospectors, drifters, and outlaws all chased the same dreams, convinced this southern borderland would be their second chance. But the world was changing. Railroads, corporations, and distant officials in polished offices saw the same map and drew different conclusions. To them, this region was not a home. It was a resource. Armadillo shows what happens when that philosophy is pushed to the limit. In Red Dead Redemption 2, it is a scrappy boomtown, a cramped main street, a busy saloon, a little theater, and a constant haze of dust and smoke. It is noisy, alive, and on the edge of respectability, a story of men and women trying to claw their way into the modern age. By the time John Marston returns in 1911, that same town has become a vision of hell. Cholera has ripped through Armadillo. The main street is lined with burned-out buildings, boarded doors, and windows covered in grime. Bodies have been buried in hurried pits outside town, and the few survivors shuffle through the heat, coughing, desperate, half-mad. The undertaker mutters about mass graves. The doctor is overwhelmed or gone. Even the churchyard feels abandoned, as if faith itself packed up and left. What happened between those two moments? The answer lies in rapid, poorly managed expansion and corporate greed. Wells and streams are overused, water grows foul, and basic sanitation never keeps pace with the influx of people. Livestock crowd the outskirts, refuse piles up behind every building, and no one with real authority cares enough to intervene. Distant politicians and company men are happy to take taxes, to sell land, to run cattle and dig for oil. But when disease comes, Armadillo is left to rot. In the truest sense, it is a sacrificial town. Tumbleweed suffers a different fate, but it springs from the same cold logic. In the early years, it is a rough but functioning settlement, courthouse and gallows standing as blunt symbols of order in a wild region. Then the railroad makes a single decision. The main line will bypass Tumbleweed and run through Armadillo instead. One corporate route, one ink stroke on a map, and an entire community begins to die. Businesses close. Families drift away. Outlaws move in. By 1911, Tumbleweed is a hollow shell, its church haunted by rumors and its streets ruled by coyotes and bandits. The old ways were dying, but nothing replaced them except neglect and fear. And that is the chilling pattern. As the government tightens its grip on places like Blackwater, regions like New Austin become dumping grounds for risk, disease, and despair. If this is what progress looks like on the border, what happens to the people who still dare to live beyond it? If the border towns became dumping grounds, the gang's old camps became something even colder, places the world forgot. The grand saga of the Linde gang, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, ends not with a gunfight, but with grass growing over fire pits and canvas rotting in the rain. Take Horseshoe Overlook. In 1899, it was the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, a high perch over the heartlands. Close enough to civilization to rob it, far enough to pretend freedom still existed. Years later, the wagons are gone, the laundry lines have snapped, and the only ones walking those ledges are deer and the occasional prospector. The ruts from wagon wheels fade into the soil. The echoes of camp songs are replaced by wind and distant train whistles. From its humble beginnings as a refuge, it dissolves back into an anonymous clearing. Farther south, Clemens Point once shimmered with firelight on the shore of Flatiron Lake. Children played, arguments flared, plans were whispered under Spanish moss. By the early 1900s, the bayou pushes back. Vines swallow the old paths, snakes bask where the poker table once sat, and the half-buried bottles in the mud tell no one whose hands held them. Perhaps a hunter stumbles on a rusted tin of cartridges or a torn scrap of blue coat. Perhaps he shrugs, pockets what he can, and moves on. To him it is salvage. To the land it is memory. Shady Belle is different. That decaying plantation was already a ghost when the gang moved in, a monument to an older, uglier order. After they flee, the house does not heal, it festers. Roof beams sag, floorboards collapse, the swamp creeps through shattered windows. In the truest sense, it becomes a palimpsest of American violence, first slavery, then outlaws, then nothing but mildew and mosquitoes. Maybe a lawman squad uses it once as a staging ground, swapping stories in the same parlor where Arthur cleaned his guns. Maybe two drifters try to rob each other in the ruined foyer, neither realizing they are arguing over crumbs in a mausoleum. Beaver Hollow, the final camp, almost seems determined to erase itself. Tucked in the woods, it collapses fastest. Rain eats the tents, mold claims the cave walls, and the last traces of Dutch's delusions sink into the mud. A trapper might notice old bullet scars in the rock, a miner might find a spent shell in the creek bed, but to them it is just debris from some forgotten skirmish. The old ways were dying, and even their footprints do not last. And here the question cuts deepest. Walking those same trails in 1911, would any traveler feel that something monumental had happened there? Or would those hills and hollows seem untouched, innocent, indifferent? The gang believed their campfires lit up the whole world. The world was changing, but the land itself barely blinked. Because that is the quiet tragedy behind the Gunsmoke. Places that felt like home to Arthur, John, and the rest become footnotes, then rumors, then nothing at all. New homesteads rise on old clearings. Lawmen pitch tents where outlaws once laughed. The story moves on, but the ground does not tell who was right, who was wrong, or who was a lost soul. It only remembers that, for a brief moment, someone was there. And while the camps fade into the landscape, the men and women who once called them home face a harsher question. What happens to an outlaw family when the fire goes out and there is nowhere left to camp? When the fire goes out, what stays warm? In the world of Red Dead Redemption, it is not the camp, not the coffers, but the shadow of a man whose name is never spoken again. Arthur Morgan does not exist in Red Dead Redemption 1. Not in dialogue, not in wanted posters, not in the official story of the Bureau that hunts John Marston across the frontier. Yet from its humble beginnings at Coulter to that last climb up the mountain, Arthur's choices quietly redraw the map of who lives, who dies, and what kind of world survives into 1911. Silence becomes its own form of recognition. If no one in game speaks his name, the landscape does. The clearest line runs through Beecher's Hope. Arthur's insistence that John leave, his stubborn work to secure the money, the horses, the time to escape, creates more than a homestead. It creates a rare pocket of stability and decency in a hardening world. While Blackwater swells with investors and Pinkertons, and while the old ways were dying in places like Rhodes and Valentine, Beecher's Hope stands as a fragile answer to Dutch's failed philosophy. A family, not a gang, work, not robbery, responsibility, not delusions of revolution. Without Arthur's intervention, there is no John to plow those fields. No Jack to grow up reading books instead of learning to draw a gun. Arthur's shadow also lies between the lines of his own journal. The sketches of ruined camps, of gang members laughing, of trains and oil fields and the slow creep of civilization form a second private history that never makes it into government reports or newspaper columns. In the truest sense, his journal is a story of the West that official history refuses to tell. The doubts of an enforcer, the tenderness of a man who buries strangers, the questions of a lost soul who begins to suspect that freedom, bought with blood, is no freedom at all. The player reads what the Bureau will never read, and so the world is seen through Arthur's hand long after his body is gone. His moral arc mirrors the frontier's own transformation. From the very beginning, Arthur is Dutch's hammer, the living embodiment of the gang's belief that violence can carve out a righteous space beyond civilization. As the years grind on, that belief collapses. Arthur moves from blind loyalty to reluctant conscience, from outlaw pride to a grim acceptance that the world was changing and some men deserved to be left behind. The West follows the same path, stumbling from brutal freedom toward regulated order, from roaming gangs to fenced ranches and federal agents. So even as Red Dead Redemption 1 rides forward without him, the people Arthur saved and the land he crossed carry him into that new era. Beecher's Hope, the Marstons, and the scarred frontier itself stand as proof that a dead man can still shape the living, and that his unfinished story will echo through the final days of the outlaw West. From that echo, the story turns back to Beecher's Hope, because the quiet little ranch Arthur helped build becomes the stage for John Marston's final attempt at an honest life. It is, in the truest sense, from its humble beginnings, a fragile experiment, an outlaw trying to believe that work, not gunfire, can define a man. In the years after the epilogue, John's days fall into a steady rhythm. He fences pastures, brands cattle, and rides the same hills he once bled across, now searching for strays instead of scores. Jack grows from frightened boy to curious teenager, reading adventure novels on the porch while John and Abigail argue about chores and money. Uncle drinks, disappears, and occasionally helps, the living embodiment of the old ways refusing to die gracefully. It looks peaceful from a distance. Up close, it is a man wrestling his own nature every single morning. But while Beecher's Hope tries to stand still, the world was changing around it. Rail lines push deeper through West Elizabeth, bringing more trains, more freight, more federal reach. Telegraph wires stitch together towns that once felt days apart, turning rumors into reports and memories into records. Blackwater swells into a polished showcase of civilization, the kind of place where men in suits discuss land grants and oil rights instead of cattle prices and poker debts. John cannot escape that tide. To keep the ranch, he has to sign papers, visit banks in Blackwater, and argue over land titles with clerks who barely glance at his face but memorize his name. Neighbors know him as a hard worker and a man trying to keep his family together, yet some remember whispers about Dutch, about robbery, about a ferry that went wrong. The outlaw who once rejected every institution now depends on them. Banks for loans, county offices for deeds, railroads to ship his cattle. Is that freedom or a slower kind of noose? This is where the government's philosophy shifts from chasing ghosts on horseback to hunting men on paper. The Bureau of Investigation does not need campfire informants when it has registries, tax records, and signatures. John's respectable life becomes the trail he can never erase. When agents like Edgar Ross arrive, they do not threaten him with prison alone. They threaten Beecher's Hope, Abigail, Jack. His family becomes collateral, then leverage, then shackles. The bargain is simple and cruel. Hunt down Dutch's remaining disciples, or watch the ranch burn and the Marstons disappear into federal custody. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, narrows into one father riding out to kill the last fragments of his own past, so his son can read books instead of wanted posters. John's tragedy is not an exception. It is a warning. In this new America, the old ways were dying, but the new ones had teeth, and the same systems that promised order could turn on anyone with a history. If the government could do this to John, what would it do to the rest of the dying West next? If John's fate is a warning, then Dutch's disappearance is a question mark carved into the dying West. When he walks away at Beaver Hollow, leaving Arthur bleeding in the mud and Micah grinning in the snow, the gang's story does not end. A different story begins, a story of exile, reinvention, and a man trying to outrun his own reflection. From the very beginning, Dutch had told everyone the same thing. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and men like him had no place in the new order. After Beaver Hollow, those words finally catch up to him. He vanishes into the wilderness, a lost soul with a satchel of money, a revolver, and a philosophy that has just cost him his family. In those unseen years, he drifts from territory to territory, keeping ahead of Pinkertons and memories, telling anyone who will listen that he was betrayed, that he was right, that his dream was stolen. Time turns distance into myth. Dutch begins to rewrite his own history, sanding down the moments of cowardice and cruelty, polishing the speeches about freedom and civilization. When he finds Bill Williamson again, he does not present himself as the man who left his followers to starve in a cave. He arrives as the living embodiment of resistance, the outlaw prophet who survived when all the others fell. Bill, insecure and eager for purpose, believes him. Javier, already hiding in the borderlands, hears the same story and hears the echo of the man he once followed to war against the world. What Dutch builds in New Austin and Nuevo Paraíso is not the sprawling camp of tents and chores from its humble beginnings. It is smaller, harsher, more desperate. This new gang is not a family in the truest sense. It is a circle around a pulpit. Dutch's followers are runaways, drifters, men with nowhere else to go, clinging to his words the way the old gang once clung to his plans. The loyalty here is not earned through shared dinners and campfires, but through fear, charisma, and the constant reminder that there is no life beyond this cause. His rhetoric shifts with the shrinking of his world. Once, Dutch spoke of books, education, and a future beyond crime. Now, his speeches spiral into paranoid rants about government agents, invisible conspiracies, and an inevitable doom closing in from every railroad and telegraph line. Was he wrong about the government's reach? Not entirely. But in his mouth, truth and delusion fuse until even he cannot tell them apart. That is what makes his alliance with the native rebels in Red Dead Redemption so tragic. On the surface, it seems consistent. Dutch, defender of the oppressed, standing with those crushed by civilization. Yet this is no longer a careful stand against injustice. It is a last doomed gesture, using a real cause as cover for his refusal to surrender. The same man who once dreamed of a peaceful retirement now pushes young warriors into bullets to prove that his philosophy still matters. It all leads to that cliff above the river, the wind howling around a man who has run out of places to hide. Dutch looks down at John, at the bureau behind him, at the world he always feared. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. His worst predictions have come true, and in that moment he understands that his violence helped them along. He steps back into the empty air, choosing death over capture, ending not just his life, but the last illusion that he was ever only a victim of history. Yet even in that fall, his shadow remains, stretching over the border, over the reservations, over the oil fields and railroads that will define what comes next. Dutch's shadow falls, but it does not fall alone. In its wake move two men who from the very beginning defined what it meant to be loyal soldiers in a war already lost. Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela are not architects of the Van der Linde dream. They are its blunt instruments. In the truest sense, their story is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of men who needed a commander more than a cause. In camp after camp, from its humble beginnings in the Grizzlies to the filth of Beaver Hollow, they stand at Dutch's shoulder, enforcing his philosophy long after others begin to question it. Arthur grows doubtful. John pulls away. Bill and Javier stay. Both men are damaged long before the gang collapses. Bill, the former soldier humiliated and discharged, clings to Dutch as the only officer who ever praised him. Javier, the revolutionary exile, sees in Dutch the living embodiment of resistance, a man who promises freedom from civilization's hypocrisy. When Dutch says they are fighting for the people, they believe him. When his plans turn cruel and senseless, they call it necessary. How could they admit that the man who gave them family is leading them toward oblivion? So when Beaver Hollow burns and the last illusions die, they do not run from Dutch. They run with him. Driven from the heartland, hounded by Pinkertons and progress, they scatter into the cracks of a continent that no longer wants outlaws. Dutch drifts toward the high mountains and frozen borders. Bill staggers south into New Austin. Javier slips further, crossing into a Mexico already boiling with revolution. Each man is still following Dutch's ghost, even when Dutch himself has vanished. In New Austin, Bill's fear curdles into tyranny. At Fort Mercer, he remakes Dutch's camp in miniature, a parody of the old days. He surrounds himself with cutthroats, drinks away his shame, and rules through violence and nostalgia. He talks about freedom, about standing up to the government, but his world has shrunk to a crumbling fort and a shrinking circle of terrified men. Is he protecting an ideal, or just hiding from a world that proved him a fool? Across the border, Javier throws himself into Mexico's endless cycle of coups and counter-coups. Once a hunted dissident, he now works for the very generals who crush peasants in the name of order. He tells himself it is still about the people, still about justice, but the line between revolutionary and mercenary blurs with every firing squad. He is forever chasing a cause big enough to justify what he has done, and it is forever just out of reach. Both men survive the gang's end, only to become checkpoints in John Marston's coerced march through 1911. Bill at Fort Mercer, Javier in the mountains above a corrupt Mexican regime, each stands as a relic of an era that refuses to die quietly. Their deaths are not grand reckonings. They are cleanup operations, ordered by a government bureau that grew out of the very hunt that once drove their family apart. In the end, Bill and Javier do not fall defending a philosophy. They fall defending ghosts, Dutch, the gang, a memory of freedom that never truly existed. And as John pulls the trigger, another question hangs over the desert and the Sierras alike. When loyal soldiers become obstacles, how long can the generals themselves escape the same fate? And not all of those ghosts fall with a gun in their hand. Some of them simply wander on, half forgotten, half ridiculed, dragging the old ways behind them like a bad leg. Uncle is one of those. In the truest sense, he is a story of what happens when an outlaw survives his own era, but never really escapes it. After the gangs fall, Uncle does what he has always done. He drifts. The game never charts those missing years in detail, but his own rambling tales fill in the gaps. He talks about drifting through New Austin, about odd jobs, cheap whiskey, bad backs, and worse women. His body is worn, his face is lined, and every joke carries a faint, half-comic bitterness, as if the punchline is that he is still here when better men are not. The world was changing, and Uncle simply floated on its surface. He becomes the living embodiment of the fading outlaw archetype. Too lazy to plan a robbery, too drunk to ride hard, too old to be a real threat. Yet behind the sloth and the tall tales sits a memory palace of a vanished West, camps under open skies, quick rides from lawmen, Dutch's speeches about freedom and civilization. Uncle remembers the very beginning, when the gang still felt idealistic, even if he mostly remembers it from the comfort of a camp chair. Is he a coward, a survivor, or just a lost soul who never chose a side strongly enough? That ambiguity is exactly why his arrival at Beecher's Hope matters. When John brings Uncle onto the ranch, he is not just hiring cheap labor. He is dragging the campfire into a fenced pasture. The banter, the complaints, the old habits of shirking work and telling stories instead of facing reality, all of it follows Uncle through that gate. Beecher's Hope is from its humble beginnings, an attempt to build a respectable life. Yet there is Uncle on the porch, linking this fragile domestic dream back to the gang's firelit nights and half-baked philosophy. And then, when the world finally comes to collect in Red Dead Redemption, Uncle does something unexpected. He stands. In those last moments at Beecher's Hope, when Ross and the soldiers close in, Uncle does not run, does not hide, does not pretend his back hurts too much. He takes a rifle, holds the line, and dies on John's doorstep. No speeches, no grand ideals, just a quiet act of loyalty that proves even the most useless relic can decide how to meet the new world. Uncle's survival into the modern era is both comic and tragic. He outlives Arthur, Hosea, even John, yet never truly finds a place that fits him. Too old for outlaw rides, too undisciplined for civilization, he is stranded between epochs. And in that stranded figure, slumped against a porch post or a barn wall, the audience sees a hint of what the West itself has become, not dead in an instant, but left behind, lingering awkwardly as the trains and telegraphs roar past toward the next chapter. If Uncle is the stranded remnant of a dying frontier, then others from the Linde circle manage something far rarer: quiet survival. Their stories unfold not in gunsmoke and blood, but in ledgers, ink, and parlors. In a world where the old ways were dying, they step hesitantly into civilization and try to make peace with it. Pearson is the clearest example. The camp's boisterous cook, once barking for deer carcasses and complaining about rabbits, ends his tale behind the counter of a general store in Rhodes. The rough stew pot becomes a polished scale, the camp ledger becomes an account book, and instead of arguing over who brought in the most game, he haggles over flour prices and canned peaches. It is almost ironic, the man who once fed an outlaw family now feeds a town that barely remembers those outlaws existed. From its humble beginnings, that store represents more than a job. It is Pearson's surrender and his small victory. He trades the illusion of freedom for predictability, the philosophy of rebellion for the comfort of routine. The mounted elk head on his wall and the old Navy revolver behind the counter hint at the past. But they are relics now, not tools. In the truest sense, Pearson chooses commerce as his ticket into the new order, and civilization chooses to overlook who he used to be. Mary Beth Gaskill walks a different road. Once a pickpocket with a soft voice and sharp fingers, she vanishes from the gang's orbit and reappears years later on a train, dressed well, a published novelist. The petty cons and staged sob stories have been alchemized into romantic fiction, sold to an urban audience that craves danger at a safe distance. She turns the chaos she lived through into neatly bound narratives, smoothing the rough edges, turning hunger and fear into daring adventures and tragic love. Her work is a story of transformation, crime into art, survival into sentiment. The gang's pain becomes her material, even if the names are changed and the endings are kinder than reality ever was. Is that betrayal, or a final act of loyalty to those who never got happy endings, giving them one on the page? Mary Beth passes through stations and salons, the living embodiment of how memory can be edited to fit the demands of a gentler, more marketable world. Then there is Tilly Jackson, a black woman who grew up hunted, branded an outlaw before she was grown. She ends not in a jail cell, but in a fine house, married into a wealthy family. Respectability, for her, comes with lace gloves, good china, and an unspoken understanding that all of it can vanish the moment someone digs too deep. She knows, perhaps more than anyone, how fragile that veneer is. A wrong word, an old Pinkerton file, a familiar face at the door, and the past could come crashing through her parlor. Commerce, art, marriage, 3 different paths out of the same fire. Pearson, Mary Beth, and Tilly prove that some members of the Linde family can be absorbed into the new world rather than crushed by it. Yet their relatively gentle fates cast a harsh light on those who stayed on the run, clinging to Dutch's ideals until the end. Did survival demand a quiet betrayal of that dream of freedom, or were Dutch's dreams always delusions in a world that had already moved on? The answer becomes clearer when looking at those who did not, or could not, make that compromise. For some, survival meant compromise. For Sadie Adler and Charles Smith, it meant exile. Their paths leave America behind, yet their departures are still part of the same story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a world that no longer has room for certain kinds of people. Sadie's journey begins in blood and ash. From the very beginning, she is introduced as a grieving widow, dragged from the wreckage of her burned homestead, a lost soul whose entire family has been wiped out by the O'Driscolls. Dutch and Arthur pull her into the gang, but grief hardens into fury. By the time the gang is collapsing, Sadie has become the living embodiment of frontier vengeance, a ruthless bounty hunter, hunting O'Driscolls, tracking fugitives, riding into danger with a reckless hunger that shocks even hardened outlaws. After Arthur's death and Dutch's disappearance, Sadie does not soften. She helps John secure his ranch, fights by his side against the remnants of the old life, and stands with him on that final ridge above Beecher's Hope. Then, she makes her choice. With John's future as a husband and father finally within reach, she rides away, talking of work in South America, of new contracts, new wars, new frontiers. Domesticity is not her ending. It never could be. What does a woman trained for frontier violence do in a new world of plantations, revolutions, and company towns? South America, at the turn of the century, is undergoing its own brutal transformations, governments crushing rebellions, foreign corporations carving up land, railroads and oil money pushing into jungles and mountains. Sadie steps into that storm, the skills of the dying American West suddenly valuable in another hemisphere. Perhaps she chases bandits along Andean passes, or guards some nervous magnate's train through a lawless valley. Perhaps she fights for a cause, or simply for a paycheck. Either way, the world was changing there too. Charles chooses a different road, but it leads away from America all the same. After helping John build Beecher's Hope and standing as quiet witness to that fragile attempt at family, he escorts the surviving Wapiti north to Canada. His mixed heritage and gentle philosophy have always placed him between worlds, but the old ways were dying around him. The U.S. government has broken every promise, sold every treaty, and turned every sacred valley into a resource to be measured and sold. For Charles, the North represents one last hope, a land where the Wapiti might live without constant encroachment, where children can grow without soldiers at the horizon. Yet empire does not stop at a border. British and Canadian authorities have their own policies, their own railroads, their own quiet machinery of civilization. In the truest sense, both Sadie and Charles understand that the American West has no place for them anymore. Sadie refuses to become a ranch wife. Charles refuses to watch his people die village by village. They escape the Bureau's files and the immediate shadow of the railroads, but not the wider forces that are reshaping the globe. If the frontier has simply moved, not vanished, then what happens when even those last distant edges begin to close in? Those last distant edges lead, inevitably, back to one place. Not a canyon or a campfire, but a city of smoke and glass. Saint Denis becomes the answer to the question of what happens when the frontier closes, the living embodiment of the new world Dutch spent years railing against. From the very beginning, Saint Denis stood apart from the rest of the map. Electric lights burn through the fog, streetcars rattle along iron rails, and factory whistles carve the day into shifts. Dock workers haul crates beside bankers in bowler hats. Beggars sleep under posters for operas and patent medicines. In a world of ranches and timber towns, this city is already something else, in the truest sense, a place where capital, not guns, decides who lives and dies. After the gang's chaos there, the trolley station shootout, the bank job, the night Hosea and Lenny never walked back out, the city does not flinch. It absorbs the violence, files the paperwork, and keeps expanding. Rail lines tighten like veins around it, pulling grain from Valentine, lumber from Annisburg, cotton and sugar from the swamps of Lemoyne. The money that once sat in safes the gang dreamed of robbing now moves invisibly through ledgers and telegraphs, turning Saint Denis into a quiet empire. Out in the countryside, the contrast grows harsher with every year. Rhodes stagnates in the shadow of its ruined families. Emerald Ranch becomes a haunted curiosity, a story of betrayal and whispered murder. Strawberry and Valentine scrape by on cattle and tourism, while Blackwater in the West races to imitate the Saint Denis model. The wealth of the new era pools in a few bright centers, leaving the old ways dying in the spaces between them. Even crime changes its face. Angelo Bronte, with his white suits, dinners, and crocodile charm, is gone. His replacements are not flamboyant barons holding court in garden parties, but faceless boards, insurance firms, shipping combines, and railroad councils. Decisions that once belonged to a single arrogant man now pass through rooms full of clerks who never touch a gun and never see the people they ruin. How does an outlaw rob a meeting that exists on paper more than in person? This is where Dutch's philosophy finally breaks. From its humble beginnings, his rebellion imagined tyrants with names and addresses, villains who could be shot off balconies or dragged from mansions. But Saint Denis proves that the real power is systemic, not personal. Law, finance, press, and politics intertwine until individual will, whether outlaw or lawman, barely matters. In the end, the city is not just a backdrop, it is a verdict. A story of freedom crushed by civilization, of dreams and delusions meeting a brick wall of bureaucracy. For Dutch, for Arthur, for every lost soul who believed the West could stay wild, Saint Denis is the future arriving on schedule, and it does not care who stands in its way. If Saint Denis is the verdict, then the oil fields and rail lines are the sentence. The city proves that the old ways were dying, the corporations prove what is replacing them. This is not just a story of outlaws fading into history, it is a story of new empires, built on steel, kerosene, and blood. Cornwall Kerosene and Tar stands at the center of this transformation, the living embodiment of ruthless progress. From its humble beginnings as one man's ambition, it becomes a machine that no single death can stop. When Dutch and Arthur watch Cornwall fall on that Annisburg dock, it feels, for a moment, like a victory. But the world was changing, and Cornwall had already planned for that. His managers, his lawyers, his shareholders, and his contracts remain, humming along in the background, ensuring that every gallon of oil and every mile of track continues to feed an invisible empire. Railroads carved this new order directly into the land. In the very beginning, tracks snake hesitantly through New Hanover and West Elizabeth, by the time John Marston rides again. They have become iron borders that decide who prospers and who disappears. Blackwater, with its ferry, its depot, and its telegraph lines, rises as the new heart of commerce. Tumbleweed, stranded off the main routes, withers into a wind-blown ghost, its main street baking under a sun that no longer brings opportunity. The train does not just carry people and goods, it carries judgment. Where gangs once fought over stagecoaches and banks, the new frontier of violence lies in oil fields and mining camps. The refineries of New Austin, the exhausted shafts above Annisburg, and the derricks that scar the horizon are guarded by hired guns and company coats, not by men chasing some romantic notion of freedom. These guards break strikes, intimidate homesteaders, and shoot to protect ledgers instead of loyalty. In the truest sense, they are outlaws with paperwork, men whose badges or contracts excuse the same brutality Dutch once preached against. Behind them stands a government eager to cooperate. The same state that unleashed Pinkertons on the Linde gang now signs, deals with Cornwall's successors, grants land, and sends marshals when laborers dare to organize. Lawmen who once hunted rustlers now drag union leaders from meetings. Deputies who once chased stagecoach robbers now escort payroll wagons and break picket lines. Is this civilization, or simply a more efficient form of control? The result is a West where the gun has not vanished, it has merely changed uniforms and motivations. Violence shifts from campfires and canyon ambushes to boardrooms and barbed wire fences. The dream of the open range is fenced off, surveyed, and monetized. So when the last echoes of the Linde gang fade and the rail whistle replaces the war whoop, a question lingers over every town and every ranch. Did the world truly become safer after the gang died? Or did the danger simply learn to wear a suit and carry a ledger? Because the next phase of this story will show what happens to those who try to live honestly in that new order. And what it costs when civilization finally comes to collect. Civilization did not just arrive with men in suits and shiny badges. It arrived in wires, rails, and engines, in the invisible web that turned a vast frontier into a mapped and measured grid. The world was changing, and the very tools that promised connection and progress became the noose around the last outlaw necks. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang survived on distance. A robbery in one county, a hideout 3 territories away, and by the time rumors caught up, the camp was smoke on the wind. But the telegraph shattered that rhythm. A sheriff in Blackwater could tap a message to a marshal in Armadillo in minutes, not weeks. A bank job in Saint Denis was no longer a local scandal. It was a statewide alert, racing along copper lines faster than any horse Arthur Morgan ever rode. Soon after, the telephone began creeping into the homes and offices of the powerful. Men who once needed a day's ride to coordinate a posse could now speak across counties before lunch. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, now had a new antagonist, the dial tone. When an express train was robbed or a government official vanished, lawmen did not ride out blind. They rode out informed, connected, and waiting at the next town over before the gang even crossed the county line. The railroads themselves finished what the wires began. Trains were not just targets, they were arteries of civilization, carrying marshals, Pinkertons, and bureau agents into places that once felt untouchable. Timetables turned the chaos of the frontier into a schedule. A fugitive could flee to New Austin, but the same train that brought him there could deliver his hunters the next morning. Freedom became a matter of hours, not horizons. Even the early automobiles, sputtering and unreliable, changed the balance. A posse with one motorcar could cover ground that would exhaust a dozen horses. In the truest sense, the land stopped protecting men like Dutch. Distance lost its meaning when engines and rails ignored mountains, rivers, and deserts that once shielded every lost soul with a fast horse and a head start. Paper closed the final gap. Standardized identification, wanted posters with proper photographs, and growing federal record-keeping meant a man was no longer just a name in a story. He was a file. He was a face. Changing hats, accents, or even whole identities could not erase the ink in some clerk's ledger. The living embodiment of the old ways was reduced to a case number in a cabinet. By the time of Red Dead Redemption, John Marston learns this the hard way. No matter where he rides, Beecher's Hope, Blackwater, the borderlands of New Austin, the Bureau can find him. Telegraphs carry his movements, trains carry his hunters, and dusty offices from West Elizabeth to Nuevo Paraíso hold his past on paper. He is trapped not by chains, but by infrastructure. In the end, the Linde gang did not just lose to better guns. They lost to timetables, wires, and filing cabinets. And the cruelest twist? The same system that could find any outlaw could also erase them, which raises a darker question the next part of this story will have to face. What happens when civilization decides which lives are worth recording at all? Those timetables, wires, and filing cabinets needed an army to give them teeth. The world was changing, and so was the man with the badge. In the truest sense, law itself was being rebuilt, brick by brick, docket by docket, until the chaos of posses gave way to something colder. In the days of RDR2, a sheriff's office was often just a room, a cell, and a man whose authority depended on his nerve and his neighbors. Posses were personal, ranchers, townsfolk, hired guns, all chasing an outlaw they knew by name. Justice could be bargained with over a bottle or ended with a bullet in the street. By the time of Red Dead Redemption, that world was fading. U.S. Marshals, bureau agents, and state police rode under federal orders, not local favors. The badge no longer belonged to a single man. It belonged to an institution. This was more than a change in uniforms. It was a story of power moving from faces to letterheads. In Blackwater, in Armadillo, in the growing towns of New Austin and West Elizabeth, law became a network of offices, telegraph lines, and case files. A marshal in one territory could send a wire and summon men in another. An outlaw was no longer escaping a town. He was defying a system. With that system came courts, judges, and procedures that turned justice into a process instead of a shootout. Trials, depositions, signed affidavits, transfer orders, the language of civilization wrapped crime in paper. Prisons expanded from rough holding cells to fortified institutions, places designed not just to cage a man for a night, but to erase decades of his life in one sentence. Was this progress, or just a cleaner way to break a person? For some, it was genuinely fairer. A drifter or ranch hand might stand before a judge instead of a lynch mob. Evidence could be questioned, witnesses challenged, verdicts appealed. In theory, the poorest farmer in New Austin had more protection than the richest rancher did a generation earlier. But the same system could be turned, quietly and efficiently, against those without money or influence. Bribes slipped to clerks, lawyers hired by railroads and oil barons, judges eager to please the Bureau, all could bend the process while still pretending it was neutral. Red Dead Redemption shows this machine in motion. John Marston is not hunted by a furious sheriff. He is managed by Edgar Ross and the Bureau, processed through paperwork, blackmail, and official letters. His family becomes a case file. His freedom becomes a conditional release. Even his death is not a duel, but an execution carried out by a firing line that has already written its report. For men like Dutch and John, this new order is more terrifying than any posse. A posse could be outrun, outshot, or outsmarted. Paperwork could not. It followed across borders, waited in filing cabinets, and resurrected old crimes with a stamp and a signature. The old ways were dying, and in their place stood a system that turned every outlaw, every lost soul, into a line item. And once law became a machine, a darker question emerged. What happened when that machine served not justice, but profit? Once law became a machine, something else began to grind forward beside it. Stories, as warrants and case files multiplied in government offices, rumors and legends multiplied in saloons, parlors, and railroad cars, turning flesh and blood outlaws into distant echoes. From the very beginning, the Van der Linde gang had tried to control its own narrative. Dutch wrapped robbery in philosophy, framed theft as freedom, and cast his family of misfits as rebels against a corrupt civilization. But the moment the gang scattered and died, that story slipped from their hands and into the presses of Saint Denis and Blackwater. Newspapers that once printed wanted posters now printed retrospectives, half reporting, half theater, turning botched heists into daring escapades and massacres into mysterious incidents on the frontier. Dime novels were even less interested in truth. They needed heroes and villains, not complicated people. An anonymous gunslinger who might be Bill, Javier, or an invented figure becomes the living embodiment of the last outlaw, his dialogue polished, his motives noble, his betrayals erased. A failed train robbery in New Hanover becomes a story of impossible odds and miraculous escapes. The names blur, the details warp. The world was changing, and it preferred clean myths to messy history. In that culture, someone like Mary Beth finds her place. She leaves the gang, learns to write, and by 1911 she is a published novelist, respected in polite society. She never pens the life and times of Dutch van der Linde. She does not expose Arthur's tuberculosis or John's compromises. Yet the theme she knows, the tension between freedom and civilization, the cost of loyalty, the weight of betrayal, bleed into her work. A fictional drifter in one of her books might carry a familiar drawl. A doomed romance might echo a campfire confession. Without ever naming the gang, she helps refine the template of the Western outlaw in the public imagination. Closer to home, memory changes in quieter ways. In Valentine, in Rhodes, in the back streets of Saint Denis, parents tell their children about the old days, when men on horseback rode in with bandanas over their faces and the whole town held its breath. But over time, stories that were once terrifying become cautionary tales, then entertainment. A storekeeper who lost a cousin to a robbery now blames those O'Driscolls or some gang from out of town, smoothing over the Van der Linde name, assigning heroism to a sheriff who hid behind a barrel, and turning a chaotic shootout into a neat morality play. Who wants to remember that the outlaw who spared them also threatened their neighbor? By 1911, when John rides again, that transformation is nearly complete. The people he meets in Blackwater, Armadillo, and beyond know outlaws primarily as stories, not as neighbors who once bought tobacco and flour beside them. They reference old gangs the way others reference legends of knights and dragons, distant, stylized, safe. A ranch hand might brag about an uncle who rode with Dutch, though the dates do not match and the details contradict themselves. A bartender keeps a revolver under the counter that belonged to Arthur Morgan, though Arthur died on a mountain and never set foot in that bar. Living history has already become folklore. This is the quiet irony at the heart of the gang's legacy. Dutch promised immortality through defiance, through refusing to bend to the new world. He told his people their names would mean something in the truest sense, that their dreams would outlast the railroads and oil fields. In a way, he was right. The gang does become immortal, but not as they were. Not as complex, wounded, lost souls trying to survive as the old ways were dying. They endure as campfire tales, as half-remembered newspaper clippings, as exaggerated barroom boasts. They live on as symbols, not as people. And in that gap, between who they were and what the world turns them into, the myth of the West finishes its work, paving the way for an America that prefers legends it can sell to truths it cannot face. But myths do not bury the dead, and legends do not clean the streets. Nowhere is that clearer than in Armadillo. By the time the story reaches 1911, this little town in New Austin has become the living embodiment of progress gone rancid. The player does not arrive to a bustling frontier hub or a proud railway stop. The first glimpse is smoke, coughing, and the slow, shuffling movements of people who already look half gone. Armadillo, in Red Dead Redemption, is a town under siege from within. Sick townsfolk stagger through the dust, clutching their stomachs, collapsing in alleys. The general store is nearly empty, the saloon is quiet not from law but from fear, and the local doctor is overwhelmed and exhausted. Outside town, bodies burn in crude pyres, black smoke smearing the sky, as if civilization itself is trying to hide its own failure. A preacher stands in the street, Bible raised, voice cracking as he tries to frame the cholera outbreak as divine wrath, as a test, as anything that makes sense of so much random suffering. Yet the roots of that suffering are painfully mundane. Armadillo is a story of a boomtown that grew faster than its backbone. From its humble beginnings as a dusty waypoint, it swelled with prospectors, ranch hands, and drifters, chasing dreams of quick money and easy comfort. Too many people, too little clean water, no proper sewage, no real planning. Wells sit too close to waste, cattle range too close to town, and the same stagnant sources serve everyone. The world was changing, but the basic work of building a safe town was left undone. In the truest sense, Armadillo is what happens when the new order arrives without responsibility. There is a telegraph office, a railroad nearby, the trappings of connection to the wider world, yet no meaningful oversight from distant authorities. No emergency medical teams, no federal quarantine, no investment in infrastructure, just a handful of local men burning their neighbors to keep the disease from spreading, and a preacher trying to hold back panic with scripture. Placed beside Blackwater, the contrast is brutal. Blackwater stands as the polished face of modernization, paved streets, electric lights, organized law, and federal agents moving in and out on official business. It is clean, funded, protected. Armadillo is its diseased shadow, proof that not all attempts at civilization are treated equally, and not all communities are deemed worth saving. One town gets a ferry, a bank, and a future. The other gets cholera, smoke, and silence. The government's relative inaction reveals a quiet hierarchy in this new America, a philosophy of whose lives matter. Blackwater is a priority because it represents capital, order, the promise of a tamed West. Armadillo is expendable, a backwater of laborers, ranchers, and drifters left to die as the old ways were dying around them. What would Dutch, Arthur, or John have seen in those burning pits and empty streets? Proof that the new world was no better than the old, just cruel in different ways? Or a warning that the same civilization that hunted outlaws could not even be bothered to save its own forgotten towns? And if Armadillo is what progress abandons, what does that say about the place's progress never truly reaches at all? If Armadillo is progress abandoned, then Tumbleweed is something even harsher, progress that never arrived in the first place. In RDR2's timeframe, it stands on the edge of New Austin as a town of dust and promise, a cluster of new boards and fresh nails hammered together around a single fragile hope. From its humble beginnings, every plank, every storefront, every saloon mirror is built on one expectation: the railroad will come. In the very beginning, Tumbleweed feels poised to matter. There are working gallows and a half-confident sheriff, poker tables shuffling coin, and townsfolk who talk about the future as if it is a train already heard in the distance. The streets are rough but alive, the church still holds sermons, and the town's philosophy is simple: hold on long enough, and the iron road will turn this lonely outpost into a hub of civilization. It is a story of people betting their entire lives on a line that only exists on surveyors' maps and in whispered conversations with railroad men. But the world was changing, and those men make their decision elsewhere. The tracks bend north and east, toward Armadillo's wells and Blackwater's harbor, toward oil, cattle, and capital. On some distant desk, a pen scratches across paper, and in that moment, Tumbleweed's future is silently erased. No explosion, no raid, no dramatic showdown, just a route adjustment, just a different curve of steel. The consequences are slow, then sudden. Trade dries up. Travelers stop coming. The sheriff who once tried to stand tall in the dust becomes the living embodiment of futility, outgunned by the very outlaws he was meant to tame. Ranchers drift away, merchants close their doors, the church bell rings less often until it does not ring at all. Struggling between freedom and civilization, between dreams and delusions, the town simply cannot win a fight it never even sees. By the time RDR1 arrives, Tumbleweed is a carcass. Signs creak on broken hinges in the desert wind. Windows are boarded or shattered, their glass crunching under boots. The church stands empty, its pews rotting, its altar watched only by dust and circling vultures. A few outlaws haunt the ruins, lurking in the hotel and the jail, turning this failed promise of community into a hideout for every lost soul who has nowhere else to go. Civilization passed on, but the guns stayed. Here, the game whispers one of its harshest truths. A single line on a map can decide which town thrives and which town dies, which dreams get funded, and which are left to bleach in the sun. Corporate interests and government surveyors redraw the world, and entire communities vanish without anyone in power remembering their names. If a town can disappear that easily, what happens to the men and women whose entire identities were tied to the outlaw life, once the world decides there is no place for them at all? For an answer to that question, the camera can drift to a place that somehow survives both the outlaws and the corporations. McFarlane's ranch stands in the dust of New Austin as proof that not every dream of the West had to end at the barrel of a gun or the stroke of a government pen. It is, in the truest sense, a functioning frontier world that learned how to live with civilization instead of dying before it. From its humble beginnings as a family operation fenced in against the desert, McFarlane's is still rough around the edges. Men ride out before dawn, storms roll in without warning, and a single broken leg can mean ruin. Yet the ranch is respectable. Contracts with rail companies, agreements with neighboring landowners, and quiet understandings with local law keep it legal. The old ways were dying, but here, a fragment of that freedom is preserved under ledger books and branded cattle. Its daily rhythm mirrors the Van der Linde gang's camps, but with a crucial difference. Communal meals around long tables replace stew pots under hanging lanterns. Shared labor in the corrals and fields echoes the chores Dutch once assigned, but no one is planning a bank job between bites of stew. The same instinct for mutual protection exists. Ranch hands will fight for each other when rustlers or bandits come prowling. Yet this is not an outlaw family bound by shared crimes. It is a story of work, obligation, and loyalty held together by wages, not wanted posters. Where Dutch's camp ran on charisma and fear, McFarlane's runs on paper. Legal land deeds define its borders. Bank loans and repayment schedules dictate its future. Supply contracts and insurance policies hover over every head of cattle. This new family is tied directly into the systems Dutch rejected, the very beginning of the bureaucratic machine he raged against. Freedom here is measured. A man can ride where he pleases, as long as the mortgage gets paid on time. At the center of it stands Bonnie McFarlane, the living embodiment of that compromise. She is no Sadie Adler, hunting her vengeance at the edge of the map, and no Abigail Roberts, dragged through outlaw life and then out of it. Bonnie's power comes from embracing the new order without surrendering her independence. She negotiates with bankers instead of robbing them, bargains with lawmen instead of shooting at them, and still rides, still works, still commands respect. There is irony here. The kind of family Dutch promised finally exists, but it wears clean shirts and signs contracts. Places like McFarlane's ranch become the West's final answer to men like him. A little freedom, a lot of paperwork, and no room at the table for a lost soul still preaching revolution to the dust. The outlaw dream fades, but the ranch house lights stay on, waiting for the next storm the world sends across the plains. But not every answer the New West gives to outlawry is as clean as a ranch house porch. Some answers fester in the marsh. Thieves' Landing is one of them, a town that feels, in the truest sense, like the world's compromise with men it claims to have outgrown. By the time John Marston rides through in 1911, Thieves' Landing is a story of crime that never left, only changed its clothes. From its humble beginnings as a muddy dock and a few shacks on the Lanahatchee, It has grown into a low, sprawling stain of gambling halls, brothels, and warehouses, all wrapped in fog and quiet menace. Smugglers offload contraband under cover of night, card sharks bleed drifters dry in smoky rooms, and lawmen ride past on the main road pretending not to see. The town survives because it is useful. It functions as a pressure valve for the surrounding counties, a place where vice can collect and burn itself out without embarrassing the respectable streets of Blackwater. The world was changing, and Thieves' Landing changed with it. Crime has not vanished here. It has become more organized, more predictable, more economically integrated into the very civilization that claims to oppose it. The crooked dockmaster, the saloon owner, the man quietly running the tables in the back room, they are not wild outlaws chasing dreams of freedom. They are businessmen in a black market economy, the living embodiment of how the old ways were dying without actually disappearing. Is this progress, or just a cleaner ledger for the same sins? Unlike Dutch's roaming caravan of tents and campfires, this place is rooted in networks. The boats that glide in from the river carry guns, liquor, and people, not grand philosophies. Telegraph lines hum just up the road, letting information and bribes travel faster than any horse. Crates move from dock to warehouse to train, feeding distant cities that will never know or care where their goods came from. Dutch once robbed trains in the wilderness to make a statement about a rigged system. Thieves' Landing quietly helps that system launder its own dirt. Which is more dangerous, the outlaw with a cause, or the criminal who has become part of the supply chain? Modern amenities turn this swampy outpost into a machine. The gambling is rigged, the protection rackets are scheduled, the corruption is itemized and paid on time. It is no longer about family, loyalty, or even open betrayal. It is about margins. Dutch preached that civilization was a cage. Here, civilization rents the cage out by the hour and takes a cut of every fight that happens inside. And that raises an uncomfortable thought. If Dutch had been born a few decades later, would he still be robbing banks in Saint Denis? Or would he be sitting in an upstairs office in Thieves' Landing, running the books while other men pull the triggers? His philosophy might have been the same, but the world would have given him a desk, a ledger, and a private room over the river, a different stage for the same old delusions. That same thought hangs over the Wapiti, too. If Dutch could have been given a desk and a ledger, what would have saved a people who had no place in this new order at all? From the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2, the Wapiti are presented as a story of promises broken in the truest sense. Their homeland in the heartlands and along the Dakota and Kamasa has already been carved up by surveyors and speculators. They have been pushed, lied to, and finally corralled onto barren land in the Grizzlies. Their treaty shredded the moment it became inconvenient for Cornwall's oil and the U.S. Army's ambitions. When Rains Fall walks through Saint Denis, he is a living embodiment of a nation that has been invited to negotiate its own disappearance. Historically, that disappearance rarely came all at once. It came through smaller, poorer, harsher reservations, each move framed as progress, each one stripping away more freedom, more memory, more control over the land. Tribes were marched into territories with unfamiliar climates, hostile neighbors, and no political leverage, then told to farm soil that would barely grow grass. Those who resisted were starved, those who adapted were measured, categorized, and slowly absorbed into distant bureaucracies. The world was changing, and it did not change in their favor. The Wapiti story mirrors this pattern almost beat for beat. Forced relocation, poisoned water, soldiers stationed in their shadow, and an industrialist using their suffering as leverage against the government. Cornwall's scheme to drill on their land with army protection is not just villainy, it is civilization weaponized, a corporate flag planted on sacred ground. When Eagle Flies dies on the hillside near Beaver Hollow, it is not just the death of a son. It is the death of one more argument that the old ways were dying slowly rather than being killed. Charles's decision to lead the surviving Wapiti toward Canada is not a romantic escape. It is an echo of countless real journeys north and west. Indigenous families crossed borders that had been drawn across their ancestral ranges, hoping that a different flag might mean fewer bullets or more honest treaties. Some found small pockets of safety, others found new agents, new papers. The same philosophy of removal hiding behind different uniforms. Charles, a man who has always been a lost soul between nations, becomes the bridge for a people being pushed off the map. By 1911, when John rides again, the likely fate of Wapiti land is clear. The reservation has either been dissolved quietly, its residents folded into some distant agency role, or reduced to a fenced, forgotten corner while the rest is fully controlled by the government and corporations. Rail lines are secure, oil interests entrenched, military jurisdiction unquestioned. A traveler passing through would see telegraph wires, ranch fences, perhaps a drilling site, but almost no visible trace that a nation once stood there and prayed, hunted, and buried its dead. That is the cruel symmetry at the heart of this world. As the outlaw way of life is erased, so too are the original stewards of the land, both crushed by the same expanding state, both declared obsolete by the same march of progress. Dutch's gang is hunted as a threat to order. The Wapiti are managed as an obstacle to development. One is remembered in wanted posters and whispered legends, the other in half-forgotten place names and artifacts in private collections. And yet, beneath that surface erasure, something lingers. If the Wapiti have been scattered, if Charles has vanished into the northern forests, what traces of their resistance still shape the men who now claim to own the West? And how will that unseen history collide with John Marston's final ride? That unseen history crashes headlong into the border, and on the other side of that line, the world is already burning. By the time John crosses into Nuevo Paraíso in 1911, Mexico is a nation on the brink, a story of revolution and repression unfolding in real time, with the dust of the old ways still hanging in the air. From the very beginning of John's journey south, the country is split between rebels and federales, between dreamers with rifles and generals with firing squads. Towns are half empty, fields are trampled, and the rail lines that promised prosperity instead carry soldiers and executions. Colonel Allende's regime clings to power through terror, while Abraham Reyes and his revolutionaries promise freedom and justice, even as they loot trains and butcher prisoners. It is, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of Dutch's rhetoric turned inside out. Civilization as a uniform, a slogan, a rifle. Into this chaos steps Javier Escuela, once the proud revolutionary of the Linde campfire, now hiding behind yet another cause. His presence in Mexico is no accident. When Dutch's philosophy collapsed under its own contradictions, Javier did not abandon the dream of resistance, he exported it. He traded Dutch's speeches about government oppression for Reyes's speeches about throwing off the yoke of tyranny, hoping a new flag might redeem an old outlaw. But the world was changing on both sides of the border. The same forces that crushed Dutch's gang in America, railroads driving deeper into remote valleys, foreign capital buying land and mines, centralized governments desperate to prove their authority, are tearing Mexico apart. Allende's modern army, Reyes's populist militias, American investors hovering around oil and rail concessions, together they turn the northern Mexican frontier into another contested edge of civilization, another place where the old ways were dying under steel and paper contracts. When John rides for Allende, then for Reyes, then against both in turn, his missions expose how small Javier has become. Once, Javier was a feared gunman whose loyalty could sway the balance in a firefight. In Mexico, he is just one more armed man in a landscape overflowing with them, one faction among many in a much larger, more political conflict. John storms forts, escorts trains, topples regimes, and somewhere in the middle of that, Javier is cornered in a crumbling ruin, less a legend than a loose end. Here the irony bites. The frontier that birthed Dutch's gang did not vanish, it moved. It slid south with the railheads and the surveyors, with contraband and refugees, and men like Javier followed it, chasing the last promise of freedom. But against the tidal forces of revolution, foreign money, and state power, an aging outlaw is nothing. Javier's fall in Mexico is not just the end of a man. It is proof that even the most stubborn lost soul cannot outrun history forever, and that the next frontier will devour him just the same. Javier's fall proves that history has caught up. But for the Bureau, history is not enough. It wants a clean ledger, a story of the West rewritten so that men like Dutch, Bill, and John were never more than footnotes under government ink. From the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption, John is not a free man on a mission of justice. He is a hostage with a badge pinned to his back, the living embodiment of the state's new philosophy: turn the last outlaws against their own legends and make them do the erasing. Ross and Fordham do not ride out themselves. They send a husband and father into New Austin in Mexico, chain his family's safety to their orders, and watch as he dismantles the only family he ever knew. Fort Mercer is the first cut. Bill Williamson, once the insecure bruiser who clung to Dutch's approval, has turned the ruined fort into a parody of the old camp, drunken soldiers, stolen guns, a wall between himself and the world. John arrives not as a brother trying to talk sense into him, but as the state's instrument backed by army artillery. The assault is brutal, impersonal, and loud. When the dust settles, Bill escapes into Mexico, yet another fleeing relic, and one more piece of the gang's past is blasted out of the frontier's living memory. Mexico delivers the second cut, and it is even colder. Javier, who once crossed rivers for Dutch's dreams of freedom, now hides in a crumbling fort, surrounded by revolution and repression he cannot control. The confrontation is stripped of the intimate arguments and desperate campfire debates of 1899. There is no Arthur to plead, no Dutch to deceive, only a hunted man and the former brother sent to bring him in dead or alive. Whether Javier is killed on those ramparts or dragged away in chains, the result is the same, another living link to that idealistic gang. Gone, Dutch is the final target, and the Bureau treats him not as a man, but as a symbol that must be publicly broken. His mountain hideout in West Elizabeth stands in stark contrast to Beaver Hollow. There are no starving families, no sick children, no chaotic arguments about loyalty and betrayal. There is a fortified position, a federal cordon, and a patient siege. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying under the slow, grinding pressure of bureaucracy and rifles. This is not justice in the truest sense. It is demonstration. By forcing John to hunt Dutch, the Bureau proves that no outlaw, no matter how mythic, can stand outside civilization's reach. Each takedown is a message to the new century. The age of legends is over, replaced by files, reports, and men like Ross, who smile as they sign death warrants. And through it all, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. If John can be used to erase every trace of the van der Linde gang from the living world, what happens when there is only John left to erase? So the Bureau finds its answer the only way this new world understands, with a rifle squad, a signed order, and no witnesses. The erasure of one outlaw becomes a military operation. At Beecher's Hope, the story of John Marston reaches its last, brutal chapter. The ranch that began as a promise of freedom and family, from its humble beginnings as a rundown patch of land Arthur helped fence and plow, becomes a killing ground. Federal agents and soldiers do not ride in shouting warnings or demanding surrender. They surround the property with clinical precision, closing in on barns, corrals, and the main house until the place resembles a besieged fort rather than a homestead. The scene is, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of the new century's philosophy. There is no romance here, no train robbery under the moon, no last great score. John does not die on a cliff with a pistol in each hand. He walks into a barn, opens the doors, and faces a firing line in a place meant for storing hay and tools. Civilization has come to the frontier, and it brings paperwork, uniforms, and a wall of rifles aimed at a single man. This is where any illusion finally dies. For years, Dutch, Hosea, and even Arthur clung to the idea that an outlaw could someday step off the train, buy some land, and disappear. RDR2 showed that dream in its fragile form at Beecher's Hope. RDR1 burns it down. The state is not hunting John for a current crime. It is not stopping a robbery in progress. It is executing a decision that men like him cannot be allowed to retire peacefully under the new regime. The bitter irony cuts deep. John is killed defending a fenced ranch, not robbing a bank or hijacking a locomotive. He dies as a rancher, husband, and father, but is condemned as an outlaw, a lost soul whose past outweighs his present. The bullets are not punishment for what he is doing in that moment, but for what he once was, for the story of the van der Linde gang, written in ledgers and case files in some far-off office. And in that instant, Dutch's old warnings echo back from the grave. He ranted that the government would reach everywhere, that the old ways were dying, that civilization would not stop at the campfire's edge. Paranoid, delusional, dangerous, yet not entirely wrong. Beecher's Hope under siege proves that there is no outside anymore, no safe distance from the state's gaze. When the gunfire fades, only smoke, blood, and hoofprints remain. Jack and Abigail ride away from the ruined ranch, two small figures against a vast sky, carrying the last living embers of the Linde legacy into an uncertain future. Where can they possibly go in a world that just proved it can find anyone, anywhere? The answer to that question will decide whether John's death ends the gang's story or merely passes it on. Jack Marston grows up in the shadow of a man the world refuses to forget and a way of life the world is desperate to erase. His story is not just an epilogue. It is a question mark at the end of an era, a story of what happens when the last son of the outlaw age is forced to grow into the age that killed his father. From its humble beginnings on that ranch in West Elizabeth, Jack's childhood is divided cleanly down the middle. Abigail pushes him toward books, toward the new schoolhouse in Blackwater, toward the promises of civilization that John never fully trusted. She wants him to chase a quieter freedom, one built on literacy and steady work instead of guns and horses. Yet every evening, Uncle leans back and fills the boy's head with tales of raids and rescues, while John quietly teaches him to ride, to shoot, to track. The boy recites poems and reloads rifles. He learns Latin names for birds and the quickest way to skin a deer. From the very beginning, he is being raised between two philosophies that cannot coexist. When John falls on that hillside and Abigail dies not long after, the compromise collapses. Jack is left with land that feels haunted, a little money that feels dirty, and a silence that no schoolteacher can answer. The Bureau files John away as a completed assignment, a closed case. The courts, the newspapers, the neat machinery of the new government all insist the story is over. But for Jack, in the truest sense, it has barely begun. What court can explain why a government that preaches law and order needed to murder the man who helped it? What textbook can justify that betrayal of loyalty and family? So Jack does something that belongs to another century. He starts hunting. He follows rumors, questions railroad men, reads names in official registers he was trained to understand. The education Abigail fought for becomes the tool that lets him track Edgar Ross through the bureaucratic maze of the modern state. And when Jack finally finds Ross fishing on that quiet riverbank, the moment feels almost ironic, a retired agent enjoying a civilized hobby, confronted by the living embodiment of the Wild West he thought he had buried. Their duel is an old-fashioned vendetta staged in a world of telegraphs and typewriters. It should feel outdated. It feels inevitable. After Ross falls, nothing magically resets. There is no gang to ride back to, no campfire to return to. Jack is young, literate, and capable, but he now carries a fresh killing, a famous surname, and a face that certain lawmen will remember. Is he an outlaw, or a citizen who avenged a murdered father? The world was changing, but it has no simple category for him. In the end, Jack stands as the last unresolved thread of the Linde saga, the living embodiment of Dutch's warning that the old ways were dying. Can someone forged by that dying world truly live in the one that replaced it? Or is he destined to become just another ghost the new America refuses to acknowledge? Jack's question lingers, and the camera pulls back from the boy to the land itself. Because in the truest sense, the last character left to follow is not a gunslinger or a lawman, but the map. The same rivers and ridges that watched the gang rise and fall are still there when 1911 arrives. Only the faces are missing. Imagine a lone rider cutting north through New Hanover, past the empty hills above Valentine, knowing exactly where Dutch's people once slept and bled. The ridge above Horseshoe Overlook is just another scenic bend in the Dakota now, yet every rock remembers wagons, laughter, whispered plans of freedom. The fields outside Rhodes and the moss-draped roads of Lemoyne seem calm, almost respectable, but under that quiet lies a story of feuds, kidnappings, and a family that tried to outrun civilization and failed. On the surface, not much has changed. The grass still moves in the wind, the swamps still choke with fog. But look closer. There are more fences where there used to be open pasture, more telegraph poles marching in straight, unromantic lines across the horizon, more ranch hands and deputies, fewer roaming bands of outlaws hunting their next score. The world was changing, and the landscape itself has been conscripted into service. That is the irony of this new West. The gunfire has faded. Yet the evidence of victory is everywhere. Ranches are tidier, train timetables more reliable, the routes safer for merchants and families. The old ways were dying, and in their place came order, profit, and a steady hum of managed progress. But ride through the old gang haunts with those memories in mind, and the silence where there were once campfire songs and drunken arguments can feel louder than any gunshot. There is no plaque at Clemens Point, no marker at Shady Bell, no monument on the muddy bank where Arthur collapsed. Civilization does not bother to name what it has erased, yet the absence is part of the storytelling. Rockstar turns the entire frontier into a negative space, a hollow cut in the shape of the Linde gang. The Bureau agents hunting John in 1911, the railroads, the oil men, they are the answer to a question the land can no longer ask. From its humble beginnings as a rough refuge for drifters and dreamers, this map becomes a graveyard of possibilities. Every town and tree line hints at the world that might have been if Dutch's philosophy had held, if loyalty had not curdled into betrayal, if dreams had not hardened into delusions. The gang is gone, but the routes they rode remain, a story of freedom that ended in fences, and a country that decided it preferred ghosts to outlaws. Those ghosts still talk, not through cutscenes or headlines, but through the half-heard conversations and weary stories that drift across saloons, train cars, and dusty porches in 1911. In the truest sense, the Linde gang lives on in the way people remember, misremember, and quietly rewrite what happened. Listen to the background in Armadillo, Blackwater, or A Lonely Way Station, and the same refrain returns. The old days. Old days of bandits on horseback, of trains brought screaming to a halt, of outlaws who walked into towns as if they owned the world. Some speak with fear, recalling massacres, blown safes, and the endless anxiety of never knowing when a gang might ride through. Others speak with a strange, reluctant nostalgia, as if those same crimes were also a story of freedom before civilization finished tightening the noose. These fragments rarely mention Dutch or Arthur by name, but the outline is unmistakable. A drifter grumbles that gangs used to have a philosophy, that they robbed the rich instead of shaking down farmers. A ranch hand mutters that the government had to make an example of some outfit up north. The world was changing, and in the gossip of train passengers and rail workers, that change becomes a hazy legend where fact and rumor blur beyond recognition. Side missions deepen that echo. A stranger leads John to an abandoned hideout tucked in the hills, its crates shattered, its campfire long dead, and talks about a crew that vanished after a ferry job went wrong. Treasure maps hint at stashes buried by men who never came back from the mountains or the swamps, their dreams reduced to a few inked lines and a rusted lockbox. Aging gunslingers cling to tales of riding with famous outlaws, boasting of loyalty and betrayal in equal measure, each one the living embodiment of a past that refuses to admit it is gone. There is a divide in these stories. Some characters romanticize the outlaw era, insisting that men then were braver, more honest in their crimes, that from its humble beginnings, the West was a place where a man could carve his own fate at gunpoint. Others are visibly relieved it is over, grateful for telegraphs, lawmen, and schedules, even if those same forces crush their own small freedoms. Between admiration and resentment, between myth and memory, the old ways were dying, but not quietly. All of this makes the world feel continuous, as if every bartender and farmhand is still living in the shadow of events once played through in Red Dead Redemption 2. The gang's last rides have become campfire stories, half warning, half daydream, and in those murmured recollections lies the closest thing to an answer. This is what happened to the Linde story in public consciousness. It's scattered into rumors and legends, waiting for the next lost soul to listen closely and wonder what really burned beneath the myth. Those murmured legends fade with the smoke of the fire. But the story does not end there. Decades later, in quiet reading rooms and crowded lecture halls, another circle forms around the Linde name. Not outlaws and drifters, but historians, journalists, and ambitious young writers, all chasing the same ghost. From its humble beginnings as rumor, the gang's legacy becomes an academic puzzle. Scholars pore over yellowed newspaper clippings from Blackwater and Saint Denis, court records from Annisburg and Valentine, Pinkerton memoranda half burned at the edges. They cross-reference wanted posters with census rolls, robbery reports with property deeds, a ferry disaster here, a train derailment there, an oil magnate's complaint buried in a legal file. Each fragment promises a revelation. Each fragment contradicts the last. In this new world of archives and footnotes, Dutch's voice survives in the strangest way, not through confession, but through condemnation. His speeches about freedom and corruption, written down secondhand by reporters or recalled bitterly in courtroom testimony, are lifted and quoted in dense books about frontier radicalism. One generation calls him a proto-anarchist railing against corporate railroads and government overreach. The next dismisses the same words as the living embodiment of criminal rationalization, a man dressing greed and paranoia in the language of philosophy. Which version is true? The record never quite agrees. The imbalance is baked in from the very beginning. Almost no first-person accounts from gang members survive. Arthur's journal, lost to weather and time, remains a rumor at best, a footnote at worst. Hosea's thoughts die with him on the steps of a bank. Sadie's memories vanish into distant countries and unmarked graves. So the narrative tilts toward official perspectives, toward Pinkerton reports, district attorneys, and the proud recollections of politicians who claim they broke the last great outlaw band in America as proof that the old ways were dying and civilization had finally won. Yet the record is not purely cold. On a different shelf, under the safer label of fiction, Mary Beth's novels sit in reprint after reprint. She changes names, softens endings, rearranges timelines. But anyone who knows the bones of the story can see the outline of Dutch, Arthur, and John in her pages. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a found family riding against a world that was changing too fast to understand. Her books blur fact and invention until readers cannot quite tell where history ends and romance begins. Over time, that blur becomes the point. Children grow up on dime novels and serialized tales clearly inspired by the gang, then encounter stern academic essays trying to scrape the legend away. Campfire fantasy, popular melodrama, legal transcript, and scholarly treatise all stack on top of one another. The gang's entire lore turns into layers: what they believed about themselves, what they actually did, what others said about them, and what history finally chooses to remember. But buried beneath those layers lies one more version of the story, waiting in a place no archivist can reach, not in records or rumors, but in the question that haunts the entire saga: what if Arthur Morgan had lived? Canon gives no mercy. On that mountain, choking on disease and betrayal, Arthur dies beneath a burning sky, his body claimed by vultures and time. Whether he crawls toward the light with honor or reaches for revenge with Micah, the result is the same. The outlaw who once believed in Dutch's grand philosophy becomes a name carved on a simple rock. His story ends so that John's can begin. But imagine, for a moment, that it did not. Imagine that in the chaos of Pinkerton's, crumbling loyalty, and Dutch's final flight, Arthur slips away. Broken but breathing, he disappears into the folds of an America that no longer has room for men like him. From its humble beginnings, this was a story of choices. So what if Arthur chose to live? By 1911, the world was changing faster than any horse could outrun. The railroads Arthur once robbed now crisscross the map in steel certainty. Telegraph wires hum over the plains. Oil derricks claw at the sky. In that world, an older Arthur might be found mending fences on a forgotten ranch in New Austin, a nameless hand who knows too much about guns and too little about rest. Or perhaps he drifts through places like Thieves' Landing, taking work as a hired gun, protecting the very corporate shipments he once ambushed. There is an irony there, the living embodiment of Dutch's rebellion reduced to guarding ledgers and rail cars for the civilization that crushed his family. Or he becomes a ghost in the towns John later rides through, an anonymous drifter who leaves at dawn, always a day ahead of the Bureau's files, never staying long enough to become a story. Yet the same forces that corner John at Beecher's Hope would stalk Arthur's every step. The Bureau that blackmails John grows out of the same Pinkerton aggression Arthur endured. Better records, faster trains, telephones in sheriff's offices, the net tightens. No more true wilderness, no more unsupervised borders, no more easy disappearances. The old ways were dying, and with them the possibility that an outlaw could simply fade into the horizon. This is where the tragedy sharpens. It is not just about one lost soul on a mountainside. It is structural, in the truest sense. The world itself has turned against the breed of man Arthur represents. His dreams of freedom, Dutch's rhetoric of resistance, John's hope for a quiet family life. Each is ground down by the same machinery of progress. So would survival really be mercy? Or a slower execution, carried out by bureaucracy instead of bullets? In that light, Arthur's death on the mountain becomes something else. A last stand not against an enemy, but against the age itself. Under that open sky, With the sun bleeding over the peaks, he may witness the final fleeting moment when an outlaw can still die free. After he falls, the West that made him begins to close its eyes for good. Arthur's death closes one chapter, but it does not settle the argument that defined his life. In the truest sense, the mountain is only the stage for a much older debate: freedom versus civilization. Dutch's dream against the world that was changing beneath his feet. From the very beginning, Dutch's central claim is simple and terrifying. Civilization, in his philosophy, is just organized cruelty. Laws are written by the powerful, enforced by hired guns, and dressed up as justice. True freedom, he insists, can only exist outside those laws, in the open spaces where an outlaw can ride, steal, and speak without bowing to a king in a suit. It is a story of rebellion against a system he sees as inherently corrupt. But when the dust settles and the gang is gone, the world that emerges does not quite prove him right or wrong. By the time of Red Dead Redemption's 1911, there is less random violence on the roads, more trains that arrive on time, more telegraph wires humming across New Hanover and West Elizabeth. People can send letters, ride scheduled coaches, buy goods in stock general stores. Towns that were once muddy outposts are now connected, regulated, predictable. Civilization delivers services, stability, and a measure of safety. Yet that safety comes with a price. Blackwater grows rich under corporate hands, while places like Armadillo rot under disease and neglect. The government's new bureau chases men like John with an efficiency the Pinkertons only foreshadowed. The old ways were dying, but what replaces them is not kindness, it is control. Railroads carve up the land, oil fields scar the horizon, and inequality hardens into something permanent. The cruelty Dutch raged against does not vanish. It simply wears a badge and carries paperwork. In this new order, some former outlaws adapt. Bonnie McFarlane runs her ranch with grit and competence, the living embodiment of a frontier spirit channeled into lawful enterprise. Tilly Jackson escapes the gang, marries a lawyer, and builds a respectable life in Saint Denis. Mary Beth turns her talent for stories into honest writing. For them, civilization is not a prison, it is a ladder. For others, that same world is a cage. Sadie Adler cannot breathe in parlors and drawing rooms. Her freedom demands open horizons, so she rides south, chasing wars and contracts far from the reach of Washington. Charles Smith, hounded by racism and haunted by what America does to his people, must leave for Canada just to exist in peace. Their only path to dignity is to step outside the very civilization that claims to be progress. So who really wins? Was the outlaw life ever truly free, when every campfire was lit under the shadow of betrayal, starvation, and constant pursuit? Dutch's camp is a family, but it feeds itself on robbery and exploitation, turning strangers into victims so its dreams can survive one more season. The New Age offers law and order, but those laws crush men like John in the name of the public good. In the end, neither side triumphs. The world simply trades one brutality for another, shifting from ambushes in the trees to signatures on government orders. The outlaw is pushed to the margins, the tycoon steps into the spotlight, and ordinary people do what they have always done: adapt, endure, and try to carve out a small circle of freedom inside a story far larger than their own. And in that uneasy compromise, the stage is set for the final act of this world's transformation, when even the last gunslingers discover that their legends cannot outrun the future. Because from the very beginning, the Van der Linde gang was never just a cluster of outlaws hiding in the trees. It was a story of a country arguing with itself, a moving campfire debate about what freedom should look like when the fences start going up and the railroads carve through the horizon. From its humble beginnings with Dutch and Hosea robbing trains and stages in the 1870s. The gang's path mirrors the nation's own march across the continent. At first, the philosophy is almost romantic: steal from the rich, strike at the corrupt, live apart from a civilization built on exploitation. Dutch talks about heading west, then further west, always chasing some untouched frontier. In that dream, the gang becomes the living embodiment of America's self-image, brave, idealistic, restless, convinced that the next valley will finally be the one where the world makes sense. But expansion has a cost. Just as the United States claimed land in the name of progress, the gang claims its survival in the name of freedom. The early robberies of rail companies, banks, and wealthy planters echo the country's rhetoric about resisting tyranny. Yet the bodies left behind tell a different story. Innocent townsfolk die in roads. Civilians are gunned down in Saint Denis. A bank meant to strike a blow against a rigged system becomes a massacre in the streets. This is America in miniature, noble ideals wrapped around bloody realities, loyalty and betrayal riding in the same carriage. Dutch's speeches tie it all together. He rants about government overreach, corporate greed, and the loss of individual dignity in words that could have come from anarchists, agrarian populists, or labor radicals of the era. He promises family, mutual aid, a world where no one answers to a king or a tycoon. But as with many real movements crushed or pushed to the margins, the gap between philosophy and practice grows wider with every failure. What happens when the man preaching freedom starts killing his own in the name of the cause? The response to the gang's chaos is just as telling. The Pinkertons move from hired guns to a proto-federal apparatus, coordinating across states, using informants, surveillance, and corporate alliances to hunt a handful of outlaws as if they were an army. Railroads, oil barons, and industrialists quietly cheer this centralization on, because a strong state that can crush Dutch can also protect their interests. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, but not by accident. In the truest sense, the landscape left behind after the gang's collapse is more than a game map. It is a country learning how to bury its inconvenient past while building a gleaming future on top of the graves. Towns clean the blood off their streets, newspapers rewrite the narrative, and the names of Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur fade into rumor. Yet the question lingers in every rail line, every telegraph wire, every lonely homestead. How much of that buried past is really gone? And how much is simply waiting to surface in a new form? That lingering question is the quiet verdict on the entire frontier. Because beneath the legends and the gunsmoke, the West was never meant to last. It was always a temporary stage, a rough scaffolding for a different kind of world that was already on the horizon. From the very beginning, the American West was treated as a resource to be harvested, not a sanctuary for permanent freedom. Railroads, cattle routes, and later oil fields demanded secure tracks, safe shipments, predictable timetables. A train cannot run on myth. Industrialization needed contracts, not passes. Investors needed guarantees, not rumors of gangs in the hills. The more capital surged westward, the less room there was for a man who could derail a payroll train with a few sticks of dynamite and a philosophy about civilization. Towns like Blackwater become the blueprint. Clean streets, paved docks, telegraph lines humming with distant voices. To the businessmen and politicians watching the numbers, an outlaw isn't a romantic figure. He is a line item of risk, a drag on growth. Every stagecoach robbery, every burned ranch, every hijacked rail car makes the region look unstable to Eastern banks and foreign investors. In a story of progress measured in profit, the outlaw West is a liability that must be erased. That economic pressure feeds directly into politics. The federal government, fresh from civil war and Reconstruction, is determined to knit the continent into a single, controllable unit. Pinkertons, U.S. Marshals, and eventually the Bureau that hunts John are not just chasing criminals, they are enforcing a vision of order. Consolidating federal power means crushing local warlords, private militias, and charismatic bandits who claim their own authority at the barrel of a gun. Dutch's gang is not only a nuisance, it is a rival narrative about what freedom should look like. At the same time, the culture is shifting under everyone's boots. A growing middle class in cities from Saint Denis to New York wants safety, predictability, and routine. These people read about gunfights from the comfort of streetcars and parlors, preferring the story of danger to danger itself. They want rail schedules, not cattle drives, wage labor, not wandering. The old ways were dying not just because the state demanded it, but because most citizens quietly preferred a world where bandits existed only in dime novels. Rockstar locks both games into this hinge point for a reason. Red Dead Redemption 2 shows the outlaw dream collapsing under the weight of progress. Red Dead Redemption shows its last, exhausted echo. From its humble beginnings to its bloody end, the Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of a frontier that cannot coexist with telephones, automobiles, and barbed wire. In the truest sense, the death of the West is both tragedy and inevitability. The games invite a kind of mourning for that rough, dangerous freedom, even as every railway spike and government file reminds the player why it could not be allowed to survive. What happens when a world built on guns meets a world built on ledgers? The next chapter answers that with cold precision. That cold precision is not delivered through speeches or epilogues. It is written into the dirt, the timber, and the broken stone. In the truest sense, the land itself becomes the final witness, telling a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, long after the last gunshot fades. This is environmental storytelling, a philosophy of narrative where no character needs to speak, because the props, the ruins, and the scars on the landscape carry the truth. A collapsed bridge is not just failed engineering, it is a promise of progress interrupted. A burned-out homestead is not just scenery, it is the echo of a family driven out or wiped away. Who lived here? Who fought here? Who fled in the night? The world was changing, and the map remembers how. From its humble beginnings in RDR2's 1899 frontier to RDR1's more ordered 1911, that memory deepens. Ride past the wreck of the bridge north of Valentine, its twisted girders rusting in the river, and it becomes clear that even civilization's grand designs can be abandoned, left to rot beside the very wilderness they were meant to conquer. Cross the plains of New Hanover, and the player finds overgrown campsites where wagons once circled and fires once burned, now reduced to half-buried bottles, a rotting crate, a lone chair facing nothing at all. In Lemoyne, the ruins speak louder. The plantation houses stand as hollow monuments to a dead order, their porches sagging, their fields wild. A charred wagon by the roadside, a lynching tree with rope still swaying in the breeze, a graveyard of rusted farm tools swallowed by weeds. Together they tell a story of a region that moved from open war to quiet, suffocating peace. Freedom came, but not for everyone. Then time jumps. Returning to familiar ground in Red Dead Redemption reveals layers of history laid one atop another. Blackwater in RDR2 is a small, ambitious town. By RDR1, it is the living embodiment of the new century, with paved streets and electric lights where muddy lanes once ran. That neat storefront might stand on the bones of some forgotten shack. That open lot where the gang once planned a robbery has become an orderly square, its past erased except for those who remember where the bodies fell. Elsewhere, absence tells its own tale. The quiet ridge where Arthur once sat with Charles becomes an unremarkable overlook, its emotional weight buried beneath passing clouds and federal surveys. The old campsites of the Linde gang leave only wagon ruts, abandoned fire pits, and the occasional trinket in the grass, as if the world itself refuses to grant permanence to outlaw dreams. Seen this way, the map becomes an archaeological site, a story of the West told in foundations and footprints. Every ruined shack, every boarded mine, every abandoned rail spur asks the same question: who was pushed aside to make room for this new order? The old ways were dying, the evidence lies everywhere for those willing to read it. And that is the quiet miracle. Long after Dutch's speeches end and John's saga is over, the world after the gang is still out there waiting to be discovered by players who slow down, look closely, and listen to what the ruins are trying to say. Those ruins are not just scenery, they are invitations. Gaps in the record, empty chairs around a burned-out campfire, asking the same quiet question: who will finish this story? From its humble beginnings, the Linde saga has always been a story of fragments. Journal entries, half-remembered conversations, wanted posters curling on weathered boards. Rockstar never assembles a single, clean timeline that explains precisely what happened in every year between Arthur's last ride and John's final stand. Instead, the world is stitched together from hints and absences, from what is seen and what is conspicuously missing. That is not an accident. It is a philosophy of storytelling in the truest sense. The result is that every player becomes a kind of historian, walking through a world that was changing and deciding how to read its traces. An abandoned cabin in New Hanover, a rusted mine in West Elizabeth, a grave on a lonely hill. Each detail carries different weight depending on the memories carried into it. One rider sees only set dressing, another sees a monument to loyalty and betrayal. Which is correct? In this world, interpretation is the only law that still holds. Arthur Morgan proves this most clearly in his absence. By the time John is building fences at Beecher's Hope, no one in his household ever speaks the name Arthur aloud. Yet every small decision John makes is haunted by a man the epilogue refuses to mention. If Arthur died honorable, saving John and warning him about Micah, then John's quiet life becomes an act of inherited redemption. a promise kept to a dying mentor. If Arthur sank into cruelty and delusions, leaving a trail of needless bodies, then that same ranch feels less like fulfillment and more like an apology to a world that Outlaw never learned to respect. Two players can ride through the identical landscape and see opposite futures. An honorable Arthur leaves behind a memory of compassion, spared witnesses, rescued townsfolk, debts forgiven in the name of mercy. That history suggests a West where, even as civilization tightens its grip, small acts of grace still matter. A dishonorable Arthur leaves behind fear and resentment, a legend of a monster in a duster coat that justifies every railroad baron and government agent who claims the old ways were dying for a reason. The map does not change, but the imagined future of that map does. Outside the game's borders, the same process continues. Fan theories about Sadie's unseen fate in South America, debates over Dutch's final years, arguments about whether Javier truly believed in the cause. These conversations function as an oral history of the gang. Every replay is another testimony, another witness stepping forward to say, this is how it happened, at least in this version of the world. In that sense, the van der Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of a legend that refuses to end. The scripts conclude, the credits roll, but the lore keeps expanding in the minds that carry it. And the real question is not what Rockstar wrote, but what those minds choose to remember next. Those memories do not exist in a vacuum. They cling to this fictional frontier because the world on screen is haunted by the same anxieties that define the modern age. The story of the van der Linde gang may unfold under oil lamps and telegraph wires, but the fears beneath it are electric, contemporary, uncomfortably familiar. From the very beginning, Dutch's rants about civilization closing and echo present-day arguments about automation and invisible systems replacing human hands and human judgment. In 1899, that threat arrives as railroads, factory towns, and oil fields swallowing open land. In the 21st century, it arrives as algorithms, drones, and cameras on every corner. The Pinkertons tailing the gang through forests and city streets are an earlier form of data tracking, a living embodiment of constant surveillance long before anyone coined the phrase. This is why the world feels less like a backdrop and more like a plausible alternate history. The trains run on schedules, the telegraph wires hum, banks balance their ledgers, and politicians in Blackwater and Saint Denis argue over law, progress, and profit. Every town has its own local power structure, its own quiet compromises between freedom and order. The player does not simply move through painted scenery. The frontier moves around them, advancing step by measured step, reminding every outlaw that the old ways were dying whether they resisted or not. Characters become mirrors in that advancing tide. Arthur, facing tuberculosis and the collapse of his family, stands at the exact crossroads between dreams and delusions, between loyalty and survival. John, trying to build a ranch in West Elizabeth, carries the fantasy that one man can carve out a safe corner while the rest of the world industrializes around him. Jack, reading books in Beecher's Hope and later walking through a harsher 1914, inherits not only a revolver but an entire philosophy about what freedom might still mean once the age of horses and six-shooters has passed. Players project their own hopes and fears onto these figures, turning a scripted tale into a story of deeply personal reckonings. The timeline itself reinforces that intimacy. RDR2 closes the frontier in 1899 and the early 1900s, right as federal agencies gain teeth, corporations consolidate land, and local sheriffs answer to distant offices. RDR1's 1911 and 1914 are not random numbers. They sit on the cusp of World War I, the full birth of the modern state, and the end of the mythic West. The bureau that hunts John is the logical descendant of the Pinkertons that hunted Dutch. In the truest sense, what happened to this world after the credits is what happens to every world when an era ends. Ideals harden into laws, legends become case files, and men who thought they could outrun civilization find themselves standing in its courthouse. The van der Linde gang's passing is not just the end of some outlaws. It is a rehearsal for every moment when a way of life, old or new, finally runs out of road. Ideals harden into laws, legends become case files, and the world moves on. Yet the trail this story leaves behind is written into every town, every survivor, every empty street, where an outlaw once dreamed of freedom. Blackwater stands as the clearest monument to that shift. From its humble beginnings as a frontier port, it becomes the polished face of West Elizabeth. Paved streets, electric lights, polite society discussing investments on the same docks where Dutch's ferry disaster shattered the gang's confidence. Armadillo, by contrast, rots in the sun. Once a rough but living settlement, it ends up plague-ridden and abandoned, a warning that civilization does not arrive evenly, and that some places are simply left behind. Tumbleweed fares no better. The railroad passes it by, the courthouse empties, and the town becomes the living embodiment of a dead promise, a skeleton of a dream that never quite made the timetable. Meanwhile, Saint Denis does not just survive, it dominates. The city Dutch once blamed for Hosea and Lenny's deaths grows richer and more entrenched, its refineries and rail yards humming while the swamps on its edges stay poor and forgotten. In New Hanover and Lemoyne, tracks multiply, telegraph lines stretch across the sky, and oil derricks punch holes in the land. The world was changing, not in theory, but in brick, steel, and smoke. Against that backdrop, the last members of the Van der Linde family scatter. Dutch, who once preached an idealistic philosophy of freedom and loyalty, spends his final years drifting from scheme to scheme, a lost soul waiting on a mountain for a meaning that never comes, until his last step into the void. Bill and Javier, who followed him from the very beginning, die as hunted men in Red Dead Redemption's deserts, reduced from feared outlaws to regional problems for the Bureau to solve. Sadie and Charles vanish into distant frontiers, carrying the old ways with them into lands the camera never visits, exiles in the truest sense. Others surrender to quieter futures. Pearson puts on an apron in Rhodes, trading camp stew for shop ledgers. Mary Beth writes stories on trains instead of robbing them. Tilly builds a family of her own, far from gunfire and Pinkertons. Their lives become the small, stubborn counterpoint to the gang's grand tragedy. Not every outlaw ends with a gun in hand. Over all of this, the government and its corporate partners tighten their grip. The Pinkertons give way to the Bureau, railroads carve fixed lines through once open ranges, oil fields and ranch combines turn land into assets. Freedom becomes something licensed, taxed, and surveilled. The old ways were dying, and what replaced them was efficient, powerful, and deeply impersonal. So what does it all amount to? A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a West that outlived its own myth, yet could not quite bury it. Civilization wins, but only ambiguously. The ghosts remain in the landscape, in ruined towns and lonely graves, asking one last question. What was the West really for, if this is how it ends? In the end, the Van der Linde gang's legacy is not carved into headstones or wanted posters. It is wired into telegraph lines, buried in railroad ties, written into laws that turn the whole frontier into a ledger. The world was changing, and the gang's true imprint lies in the systems that rose to contain them. From its humble beginnings as a roaming band of idealistic outlaws, their story of rebellion forced the state and its partners to evolve. Pinkertons became federal agents, private detectives became the living embodiment of national authority, and the fragile patchwork of county sheriffs hardened into a coordinated apparatus. By the time the world reaches 1911, the bureau that hunts John Marston is not an accident. It is the logical conclusion of years spent chasing Dutch's philosophy across rivers and mountains. Every robbery, every shootout, every train derailed in the name of freedom becomes evidence in a larger argument. Their legend is retold not as a warning about greed or betrayal within a family, but as proof that the frontier must be watched, mapped, and measured. More law, more surveillance, more corporate control. Railroads claim more land, oil fields expand, Blackwater grows into a polished showcase of progress, and the old ways were dying under a tide of paperwork and profit. The gang dreamed of stopping civilization. In the truest sense, they helped justify its most suffocating forms. For the survivors who slipped the noose of that life, the legacy is more intimate and more painful. To Uncle, Pearson, Mary Beth, Tilly, Charles, and others, the gang becomes a bittersweet memory, a campfire world where loyalty could still outweigh money, where a lost soul might be given a second chance. Yet that same family had to die so they could live. John's ranch at Beecher's Hope, Tilly's quiet domestic life, Mary Beth's writing, Charles's search for peace in the North, all are built on the graves of those who refuse to change. Riding through this world after the story ends feels less like roaming a map and more like wandering a graveyard of choices, victories, and failures. A burned-out homestead recalls a botched rescue, A silent rail line whispers of dynamite and gunfire. Even a busy street in Blackwater carries the echo of a ferry job that shattered the gang's illusion of control. Every familiar landmark becomes a question. Was any of it worth the cost? That is the final irony. The Van der Linde gang did not merely live in a doomed world. Through every heist, every speech, every desperate stand, they helped create the very conditions that destroyed them. Their saga is tragic not just because they fall, but because their struggle arms the world that pulls the trigger. And the greatest twist of all is still waiting. In The Last Man Left Carrying Dutch's Shadow, the greatest twist is that even after the last man carrying Dutch's shadow falls, the shadow does not. The credits roll on Arthur in the mud and on John in the snow, but the world of Red Dead Redemption does not bow with them. It keeps riding forward, indifferent, swallowing their names the way the railroad swallows the prairie. In the truest sense, the saga is not just a story of men. It is a story of a world changing pace, changing shape, and quietly forgetting. When Arthur's grave is left on that lonely hill, trains still whistle through Annisburg, oil still burns over at Cornwall's operations, and the telegraph wires still hum over New Hanover. When John's blood soaks into the dirt at Beecher's Hope, Blackwater's investors are already counting new profits, and the bureau that hunted him is sketching out the next necessary sacrifice for civilization. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s to the dying embers of the frontier in 1911, the map itself becomes the living embodiment of time. A ride through Lemoyne in 1899 shows plantations clinging to a dead order, roads still half-formed, the war's ghosts still fresh. That same region in John's era feels tidier, more managed, its chaos folded into courts, contracts, and corporations. What changed in those unseen years? Which nameless clerk signed the papers that finally broke a family, or fenced off a valley, or buried another outlaw dream? Every return to the games turns those gaps into invitations. A familiar path from Valentine to Emerald Ranch becomes a quiet timeline, where small differences in fences, posters, or patrols hint at unseen decisions and forgotten struggles. A ruined building in New Austin, a boarded-up storefront in Armadillo, a more prosperous ranch in West Elizabeth, each is an unwritten sequel, a consequence of actions never shown but always implied. Who died there? Who moved on? Who stayed and made peace with the new order? In this light, every ride across the map becomes an act of excavation. Overheard conversations about the old gang, Pinkerton rumors, or some ranch hand mentioning a robbery long ago turn into artifacts of a buried age. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the player's quiet passage through it all feels less like sightseeing and more like walking through a museum that never closes. That is why the Van der Linde saga feels larger than two games. It becomes a full, tragic history, stretching from the very beginning of Dutch and Hosea's ideals to the last echo of John's name in a barroom story. The map remembers even when the characters do not. And in the end, someone has to decide how deeply to read those traces, how much of that fading history to carry forward into the next ride, the next question, the next lingering look at a lonely grave. Someone has to decide what to do with those traces. That is where the story leaves the gang and turns to the people still crossing that world, still riding past the graves and burned-out camps and half-remembered legends. Because a story of freedom and betrayal does not end with a gunshot, it lingers in the places where questions refuse to die. Every campfire in New Hanover, every boarded window in Rhodes, every quiet night in Blackwater invites another interpretation. Did Charles ever return to those northern plains, or did civilization swallow the last of his peace? Did Sadie fall on some distant battlefield, or retire under a false name, watching the railroads carve up the land she once bled for? Did Jack, the living embodiment of both outlaw blood and educated ambition, truly escape the shadow of that ranch, or only trade one prison for another? The world was changing, but its ghosts remained. The map itself offers a challenge. One continuous ride, from its humble beginnings in the snowbound chaos of Coulter to John's last stand at Beecher's Hope, reveals a single, unbroken line. Treating both games as one long journey turns familiar scenes into echoes and warnings. A saloon in Valentine becomes a memory when passing through Blackwater years later. A train Arthur once robbed now carries the very agents who will corner John. Played back to back, the tale becomes, in the truest sense, a story of repeating patterns and broken cycles. Some choose not only to read that history, but to rewrite it. Fan artists paint Sadie growing old in a foreign land, Charles leading a new family far from the reach of Washington, Jack abandoning guns for ink and paper. Video essays trace the philosophy behind Dutch's delusions, imagining worlds where he listened to Hosea, or worlds where Arthur survived long enough to see the old ways were dying for good. In those alternate futures, the gang's shattered family keeps moving, if only on a page, a canvas, or a screen. There is always a moment when the realization lands that the world has moved on without them. For some, it is the first return to Horseshoe Overlook, silent and stripped bare. For others, it is walking through a modernized Blackwater or standing at Arthur's grave while birds sing over a man civilization never knew. Which place hit hardest? Which silence felt loudest? In the end, the fate of this world does not belong only to Pinkertons, barons, or government files. As long as writers keep retracing these trails, arguing over Dutch's philosophy, mourning Arthur's loyalty, debating Jack's future, the tale refuses to fade. The old ways were dying, but the story endures. And somewhere out there, another rider is just now approaching that first campfire, at the very beginning of it all. So the tale circles back, not to a gunfight or a robbery, but to the land itself. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, yet the places that held this story of loyalty and betrayal still stand, silent witnesses to everything that was lost. High on that windswept hill above the heartlands rests Arthur Morgan. Wildflowers creep around his grave, the grass bending under the same weather that once stung his face on long rides. Birds cut lazy circles overhead, indifferent to the outlaw buried beneath. Arthur was the living embodiment of a dream of freedom and family that could not survive civilization's advance. And now, he lies between sky and soil. A man who chose loyalty in a world that rewarded betrayal. Far away, on that sheer cliff where the gang finally tore itself apart, Dutch's last stand with Arthur and Micah still hangs in the air. The rocks remember the echo of raised voices, the thud of bodies, the moment of philosophy that began from its humble beginnings as rebellion collapsed into pure delusion. Dutch walks away in both games, but the cliff is what remains, a monument to how ideals fracture when a leader cannot admit the dream is dead. Down in West Elizabeth, Beecher's Hope sits quiet, its fences tracing the outline of a different future. A homestead carved from land once crossed by riders on the run, now tilled by a man who tried to leave the outlaw life behind and was dragged back in. Every board of that house is a compromise between freedom and safety, between the gun and the plow. It is, in the truest sense, a fragile answer to a question this world never stops asking. Can a man outrun his own story? Ride south and the illusion shatters. Armadillo rots in the sun, its main street choked with dust, its people scattered or dead. Where progress was promised, decay took root instead. Plague, greed, and neglect turned a frontier town into a warning. Civilization does not always mean salvation. Sometimes it just changes the shape of the suffering. And then there is Jack Marston, a lone rider against a swollen horizon. No gang at his back, no father to guide him, just a rifle, a name, and a question he cannot stop chasing. He is a lost soul raised on legends and corpses, proof that the consequences of one generation's dreams and delusions fall hardest on the next. In this world, loyalty and betrayal, progress and decay, freedom and control ride side by side, never fully defeating one another. The land remembers even when people forget. Trails cut by Arthur's horse, by Dutch's retreats, by John's desperate rides to town, still exist in the code, waiting for another rider to trace them again. That is why riders keep returning here. Not only for gunfights or showdowns, but to feel the weight of an era ending, to stand in the space between outlaw myth and the cold machinery of civilization, to watch the sun fall over a dying west and hear, in the distance, the twin heartbeats of this world, the fading thunder of hoofbeats, and the relentless cry of a train whistle, announcing a future that has already arrived and a past that refuses to disappear. The world was changing, but the questions did not. After the gunsmoke clears and the graves are filled, who keeps wondering what became of every town, every ranch, every lost soul, left wandering in the shadow of the Linde gang? Those who remain at the very end of a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom and civilization, are the ones who want to know what happened after the camera turned away. For those still here, One simple request hangs in the air like dust in the dying light: subscribe, like, and share. Not as empty ritual, but as a signal that this kind of long, patient, full saga excavation matters. Each click is another log on the fire, another reason to keep tracing entire timelines, to keep following this world from its humble beginnings to its final, quiet aftermath. There is more waiting out there than one gang's collapse. Imagine a deep descent into Dutch's philosophy, not as quotes on a loading screen, but as a slow unraveling of how an idealistic outlaw preacher became the living embodiment of his own worst fears. Imagine an entire chapter on Arthur's guilt, on John's survival instinct, on Micah's hollow bravado. Who were these people when the shooting stopped? When the world no longer needed men with guns, but they did not yet know how to be anything else? Beyond the campfire of personalities lies the wider map. Region by region, the land itself can be read. New Hanover turning from hunting ground into industrial corridor, Lemoyne hardening under political machines and corporate capital, West Elizabeth completing its march into polished, fenced-off respectability while New Austin rots at the edge, a graveyard for the old ways that were dying. Future journeys can follow each territory across decades, from train robberies and backroom deals to courtrooms, rail offices, and oil fields. And there are other worlds. Entire timelines can be drawn for Rockstar's different frontiers and cities, from the first whispered schemes in a Saint Denis back alley to the last neon flicker in a distant metropolis. Each video can become an atlas of cause and effect, tracing how one robbery in 1899 echoes in a government bureau in 1911, or how one broken promise in a saloon shapes a nation's memory. To stay with that story, notifications must be turned on. Let this channel be a campfire in the dark, a place where long-form storytelling circles back on itself, where every new entire lore exploration is another night spent listening to the past argue with the future. When the next tragedy rides in, let it not pass unnoticed. Gratitude here is not polite applause, it is recognition. It takes a particular obsession to care what happens after the story ends, to stare at a quiet field or an abandoned street and ask what history bled into that soil. Those who remain for that answer are, in the truest sense, the last defenders of these fading myths. So the ride pauses, but it does not end. As Arthur once warned, and Dutch could never accept, the world was changing. Hit subscribe, stay in the saddle, and be there to watch the next great dream rise, fracture, and fall.